What was your first role when you were hired at DiC?
My title was VP of Creative Affairs, and what that meant was I was supposed to be in charge of the sort of creative direction of the company, working directly for Andy Hayward, who was at that point, the owner and president of the company, and was ultimately in charge. My specific focus was to be on the writing, because that was my background. I'd been a writer and worked with writers at Filmation and worked with rewriting and that sort of thing. So, I mean, my main focus was scripts, but my general focus was, I think, creative affairs, and just to help Andy on the general creative side of the company. He had just bought the company, and the company was exploding in terms of the work that they were about to get, had started to get, and were about to get, and Andy needed help.
What year? First of all, what year was that you ended up getting hired?
It was fall of 1986.
Okay. And do you remember what the first show you ended up working on at DiC was?
Well, there was a show that was already in production that was called Lady Lovely Locks, so there wasn't very much left for me to do on that. I don't remember very much about it, to be honest. It was based on a Mattel and a girl's toy this time. And one of the very first things I remember doing there was Ghostbusters was going into its second season. I think it had its first season in syndication, and it was going to be either its second or first season on the network. But I remember having to deal with the network version of Ghostbusters, which was on in both syndication and network at the same time. And explain the difference between network and syndication?
Yes, you please do.
Well, a network was basically, everybody knew what it was. It was Saturday morning, and it was ABC, NBC, or CBS. That was it. At the time, there were only 3 networks, and all their kids shows were on Saturday morning. And that was sort of the mainstay of the animation television business. But a new market had been developed by Lou Scheimer and by DiC at the same time. Filmation and Lou did it with He-Man, 1983, the same year that DiC did Inspector Gadget, 1983. And these were shows that were sold in each market individually. They were not broadcast down the main channel of the network, but they were sold to local stations and local affiliates, town by town, city by city, all over the country. And each station would broadcast it whenever they wanted to, so it would not be on at the same time. It wouldn't even necessarily be the same episode. It was a local broadcast, and those were always broadcast on weekdays, typically in the afternoon. So it created a whole new market for animation, and a huge new market for animation, because since these shows were on 5 days a week, we needed 5 times as many episodes for each season. So whereas a network season would be 13 episodes, a syndicated series would be 65 episodes, having to be produced in the same time frame. So it was an immense boom and boon to the TV animation industry. It put so many people into work, especially writers. I mean, writers just feasted in this era when syndication came into play, and that was during those years. And so anyway, to answer your question. One of the first meetings I remember at DiC was on Ghostbusters, and the meeting was with the Real Ghostbusters I'm talking about now, the DiC version, based on the Ivan Reitman movie. And the meeting was with Ivan Reitman's 2 lieutenants, who were in charge of the show, basically, ABC. ABC had a psychological consultant, and me. And I think this might have been my first meeting at DiC, and it was such a shock to my system, because I had come from Filmation where everybody got along, and basically Lou Scheimer made the decisions at Filmation. If there was ever any question about it, he would just make the decision. And as I think I mentioned previously, Lou pretty much sheltered his employees from the rigors and demands and conflicts and insanity of the business outside of Filmation. Lou sort of took the heat and dealt with the rights holders and dealt with the networks and dealt with all that stuff. And we always just got one message, which was from Lou, and that was it. And that was very easy to work that way and good to work that way. At DiC, I found out that most of the deals that DiC had made basically granted approval rights to multiple parties. In this case, Ivan Reitman, in case of Real Ghostbusters, Ivan Reitman had approval rights. I think Columbia Television had approval rights. They had an executive that was involved in this, because they owned part of the underlying rights. ABC had approval rights. So you have all these different parties that all have approval rights and often did not agree. And it's an absolute nightmare, because you got two or three really strong-minded parties with strong opinions that have contractual approval rights that want something different from each other. And basically, these were essentially unsolvable problems. And I remember the very first meeting, one of the Ivan guys just laid into one of the I think it was the ABC site consultant, who was there to sort of, give input about child development and what would be too scary for kids and that kind of stuff. And this guy just, they had huge success with the Ghostbusters movie, and I didn't want to hear it. I mean, it's just, it was so, I don't want to quite say rude. That would be going a little too far. But they were so unyielding and so forceful in their position, and so, let's just say, completely lacking in any tact whatsoever. And I'm thrown into this whole thing, and it was, I couldn't believe it. I went in to see Andy afterwards. I said, what am I supposed to do? And he said, his sort of key response to me in all of these situations, which were to continue throughout the years, he'd say, Robby, just manage it. And I had never, nobody had any idea what that meant. I mean, it basically meant, I don't know what to do either, but it's your problem. Go take care of it. So that was kind of I sort of look upon that as my welcome to Deke and to the world of, the real world of showbiz from which I had been sheltered at Filmation all those years. And I kind of felt like, a gazelle that had been raised in captivity and suddenly thrown into the jungle, or I felt like maybe the character from Midnight Cowboy, Joe Buck, who goes to New York thinking he's going to be a big stud, and he's a small town guy and he hits the cold realities of New York, and it doesn't go well for him. And that was sort of my first couple of years at Deke. Were many, many such situations, and my blood pressure went up. Literally, I'm not exaggerating. My blood pressure went up 20 or 30 points that first year or so. But eventually, I kind of figured it out, and I found my footing. I got used to it, and figured out how to adapt and deal with it, and at least not let it. My blood pressure went back down. Let's just say I learned how to survive in the jungle.
Now, you said you worked on the second season of Real Ghostbusters. Had the first season already been produced?
I believe. I'm trying to remember. I think what might have been the case, and I don't hold me to this, but I think it was the first network season had already been on, and now it was going to go, and now the syndication was starting. I think maybe that's what it was. Although the syndication shows had already been produced when I got there. I mean, I think that fall it was the second network season was on the air, and the first syndication season was on the air. And I think these meetings that I was involved in were to deal with the third season of the network. That's what I think it was.
Okay.
Which would have started in fall of '87. I mean, it was a big hit, so the network would have already known that they were going to do another season of it. So I think we were probably there talking about the next. I think that's what this meeting was about the next season of Ghostbusters.
Now, were those the changes that went in the way of the cast changes and the ultimate format change to Slimer and the Real Ghostbusters? Because I know there was a big difference changed.
Yeah, there was, and that might have been. I'm not sure if it was that year, but there was that change. We did. I think that probably is what it was. It probably was the year that we changed it to Slimer and the Real Ghostbusters. I don't remember there being a cast change, only because I wasn't there for the previous seasons. I was only there from obviously from that point on, and so I'm not aware of. I don't remember how it started. I only kind of remember how it went forward. And I know it. We did change it to put an emphasis on Slimer, because Slimer was a huge hit as a character. He was really fun, and so I think there was a decision made to sort of slightly rebrand the property to sort of feature Slimer. And I think didn't we? You probably remember this better than I do, but I think didn't we do a deal where Slimer sort of joined forces with them and became their kind of like their pet? Wasn't that?
I believe, yeah, something to that effect.
I think that's what we did. Do
you remember working on, this is one of which was the new Archies? I know you did a lot of Archie cartoons.
Yeah, we did. We did the new Archies. We did Archie's Weird Mysteries. We ultimately did Sabrina, which was based on Archie comics, although everybody knew it from the live action property at that point. But it was an Archie. I even worked on a Sabrina development back at Filmation. We tried to do something with Sabrina even before it had been got to be a primetime hit. So yes, I was well familiar with the Archies, and of course Filmation had the huge animated hit of the Archies, but that was before my time at Filmation. But yes, I worked on several Archies projects. The new Archies was for NBC, and I don't remember whether we pitched it. We must have pitched it to them, and I don't remember whose idea it was to sort of try and modernize it and make it the new Archies and give it sort of a slightly more hip for the time spin. But I remember it was on NBC. That's pretty much all I remember about it. I remember, Archie Comics was the rights holder. We dealt with the owners and founders of Archie Comics, who was a man named Michael Silberclyde, and his son David Silberclyde was sort of taking over the business. And we had a very good relationship with them, which is why we were able later to do Archie's Weird Mysteries, which we did for syndication. And then we later got involved in the Sabrina cartoon based on the live-action series. That the live-action had become a huge hit, big hit in live-action. And it was always the same rights holders. So we had a leg up because we had a history with these rights holders and a very good relationship with them, I might add. Very good.
I have Beverly Hills Teens. What do you remember about that show?
Well, we had done Beverly Hills Teens. Yes, it was kind of it's funny you mention Archies, because I think we kind of thought of it as like Archies meets Beverly Hills 90210. I think 90210 had already been on the air at that point, I think. And Andy lived in Beverly Hills, and he was going to there had been movie Down and Out in Beverly Hills,
Mm-hmm.
and Beverly Hills Cop, these were huge hits. And I think 90210, maybe that hadn't happened yet. I'm not sure if I'm remembering the chronology right.
Beverly Hills 90210 premiered 1990.
Well, then, okay, so then Beverly Hills Teens preceded that then. So you can strike that off my list. But nonetheless, Andy was convinced, and 90210 is another example that he might have been right. Andy was convinced that if you put Beverly Hills in the title, it helped make it a hit, that people just had a fascination with Beverly Hills. And I suppose there's evidence that he was right. So I think his idea was to kind of come up with our own set of characters that were somewhat Archie-like, teen characters, set them in Beverly Hills and call it Beverly Hills Teens. And honestly, that's all I remember about it. That was one of the very, very first things that I worked on when I came to Deke, one of the first new series that I worked on. And, we were doing so many series. My plate was so full. When I first went to Deke, I had this image that I was going to be very creatively hands-on in all the writing. And more as I'd been at Filmation, where I was actually writing things and, giving notes on every script and really supervising the writers very closely, which is what I did in my role at Filmation. I assumed that's what it was going to be at Deke. And what it turned out to be, because of the quantity, there was just such a quantity of things, I just had to delegate more and more. And mostly my job was to try to hire really good people to be story editors, which is the sort of name of the job in TV animation where you're in charge of the scripts. The story editors were, under my administration anyway, the story editors were all empowered to hire whatever freelance writers they wanted to use. I didn't dictate to them which writers they had to use. They could use the writers they wanted, but they just had to turn in scripts of a certain quality that met certain standards. And sort of how they went about that was their business as far as I was concerned, unless of course there was a problem, in which case I had to get more hands-on involved. But as long as they were delivering the goods, they could do it how they wanted to, because I might be working on 5 or 6 series at a time, 2 of which had 65 episodes, and all of the scripts had to be produced, within a period of 3 or 4 months. I mean, it was insane quantity of work. And the other reason that I found myself less hands-on was the sort of contractual setup that I just mentioned previously, which is that almost every series we had a rights holder that owned the underlying rights, and a network that both had sort of creative approval rights, and both had very strong opinions. And the last thing anybody needed was a third creative opinion, namely mine. So there was already enough people arguing about how things should be. So I found more and more that people weren't particularly interested in how I wanted things to be. They just wanted how they wanted things to be. And my job became, frankly, often more of a mediator and an executor than a creative visionary. I sort of came to Deke with the hopes that I could be a creative visionary on some series. And it didn't really turn out that way. It turned out to be more of an executive function than a creative function. And it was a stretch for me, and it was a real, it required me to adapt, and really wasn't what I had set out to do. But that's what it was.
Which companies were the easiest to do those sorts of negotiations with in terms of content, and which ones were the most difficult? And you don't have to answer the second part if you don't want to.
I will answer it.
Okay.
I'll definitely answer it. The networks were really difficult because they had so much power in those days. At first there were 3 of them, only 3, and then Fox came into the picture, and then there were 4. And this was before Nickelodeon, before all the cable outlets. There was syndication. That was the only other outlet. But the main money and the main power of the kids business, was basically held by 3 people, 3 individuals. And these people had the power to make millionaires of the producers that they chose to give their licenses to it and buy shows from. They were buyers with the ultimate power, and they wielded that power, let me tell you. So they were always a challenge to work with the networks. Very, very challenging and very demanding. Some of the rights holders was a broad spectrum. I'd say both the worst experience and maybe the best experience I ever had with rights holders was the same rights holder, and that was Sega, because they changed personnel. The first person that they assigned to us was just an absolute nightmare to work with. And frequently they would assign people to us that knew nothing about animation production, and had no interest in learning about it or trying to facilitate us doing the best job we could. And instead, what they did was made it difficult for us to do a good job. And I would say our first designated supervisor from Sega was just terrible and made it impossible, very difficult to do good work. And yet, they later replaced her with a woman I will name, because she was fantastic. And she was the polar opposite and totally changed our fortunes with Sega. And her name was Jane Thompson. And I'm friends with Jane. I'm still friends with Jane to this day. She came from a production background, and she understood how production worked, and she understood how to elicit the best work out of creative people rather than shutting them down. I mean, one of the things you learn, and I had to learn it too, is when you're working with talented people and creative people, you have to work with them in certain ways, and you can't just always dictate. If you just dictate and you're dictatorial, you won't get the best work and you won't get the best result. And frankly, you're not always right. The reality is no one is always right. And if somebody is given power and is convinced they're always right and is obnoxious and dictatorial about it, it can ruin things. Anyway, Jane was the opposite of all those things. She was a pleasure. Everybody at Geek loved her, and she made a lot of contributions to the series. And we had some other good ones along the way and some other bad ones too. I'm trying to think of some of the good ones I could credit.
Well, in that thought, did you enjoy working with Sanrio and MGM TV on Hello Kitty?
I have so little memory of any contact with them, so it must have been okay, because you remember the bad ones much more than you remember the good ones. So I think they didn't. I don't think Sanrio took an active role at all, and MGM TV I think took a de minimis role. I think I vaguely remember the approval person at MGM, and I think he was fine. I think he read the scripts and may have given a few notes, but it was certainly not a problem, for sure.
You worked on 2 Alf cartoons?
Yes, that was interesting. I hadn't watched Alf when we made this deal, but it was a huge hit, and it was natural for a kid's show, and I think we pitched it to NBC. It was an NBC show, so if we were going to do a Saturday morning show, it would have had to be on their network. Whenever you were trying to do a cartoon based on a primetime show, it pretty much by definition, the only chance you'd have would be on that network's Saturday morning outlet. And so that was the case with Alf. And one of the things I remember about Alf is I had to watch a whole bunch of episodes to get myself current with it before we started the production. And I loved it. I fell in love with it. It was just fantastic. A really fun show. And I remember the first meeting we had with the creators of Alf and the network. And the creators of Alf had basically heard things about the Saturday morning network head. And they had heard not good things about her. And they basically came into this meeting guns a-roaring. Because when you're a producer on a primetime hit, you are all powerful. I mean, it's always a question of pecking order and power in the entertainment industry. And these guys just had much more power than the Saturday morning executive. They were much more important to the network. They were bringing in far more revenue to the network. And they didn't have to listen to anybody. Plus, they had a very good relationship with the head of the network, who was, at the time, was Brandon Tartikoff, I believe, who was a brilliant executive. We ultimately did some work with Brandon, and he was incredible. And he was a big fan of Tom Patchett and Paul Fusco. Those were the two creators of Alf. Tom was an old, sort of a seasoned sitcom writer back from the days of Mary Tyler Moore's show. And Paul was a younger guy, and he was the actual puppeteer and the voice of Alf. His name was Paul Fusco. So the two of these guys had created the series and were the showrunners of it. And they came into this meeting with the network and us, and they just laid into the network and said, we're not going to listen to, I mean, they didn't use these words, but they basically said, we're taking absolutely no shit from you. We don't care what you say. Shut up, and we're going to make our show. Was essentially what they said. It was, and I was there with Andy, and we just, they weren't yelling at us. They were yelling at the network. We were just, as usual, we were kind of in the middle, and there was really nothing the network could say about it. I mean, the Saturday morning person worked for the prime time person, and the prime time Brandon Tartikoff, and the prime time, Brandon Tartikoff was head of the network, and he basically was going to support anything the Alf people said. So they pretty much had to take it. So anyway, we went on to produce the show. Actually, I was quite intimidated by those two guys at first because they were so forceful. But they turned out to be, they were really creative. For one thing, they were brilliant. And we had a good relationship, a really good relationship with them. And I think we did a pretty good show. We did two different Alf shows. The first one was just just sort of an animated version of Alf itself. And the second one we did was a thing called Alf Tales. No, actually, you know what? I'm forgetting this. I'm remembering. I think the first one was back on his old planet, Merrimack. I think that's what we did. I think we originally were going to just do animated stories, based on Earth, in the same setup that the primetime show was. But I think we got the idea that it was no point to doing the same thing in animation. And I think as I recall, what we did is we did his home planet, which I believe was called Merrimack, and I think we did his adventures back on his home planet. You might remember better than I do.
I can confirm. And that was the first one.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's what it was. I mean, I've worked on so many series, you'd think I'd remember these things, but I obviously don't. The second thing we did, I think we did a season of that. And the second season we did a thing called Alf Tales, which I think we took fairy tales and just twisted them completely and sort of told Alf's versions of fairy tales with him in them, as I recall. And I think those were our two Alf series. I don't think they performed that well, to be honest with you, or I think they would have. I think we only did one season of each, and I think if they'd performed better, they would have been on longer. But I recall it being a good experience. That's my general recollection of these series are going to be, for the most part, are going to be just what my experience was in producing them, and how much stress and aggravation cost.
I'm guessing the ones that you remember better are the ones that were more stressful experiences.
Typically, but that's typically true. Yes, that's right. That's right.
Okay. Well, within that note, Dennis the Menace, was that a stressful series?
No, not at all. That was I think sort of in production when I first arrived there. So I didn't have a whole lot to do with it. It was already sort of set up and the scripts were in work. And Hank Ketchum, who was the creator of Dennis the Menace, I think he had deferred his approval rights, as I recall, to the syndicator. And the syndicator that was going to be a series for syndication, as I recall. I may not be remembering it correctly,
right.
But I think it was syndication. And I've forgotten, the syndicator was, I want to say it was General Foods. Am I right?
General Mills.
Kellogg's?
GM.
It was General Mills, right. And it was their advertising agency that was sort of the syndicator. It was for their advertising arm, and they had a syndicator. And the syndicator was a guy named Alan, I want to say his name is Alan Banks, and his lieutenant was a guy named Chris, and I can't remember his last name. They had a great relationship with Andy, super relationship with Andy. And I got to have a good relationship with them as well. And we did many, many things with them over the years. And they were great people to work with. So, I mean, it really all boiled down to that. If you had good people to work with that weren't monsters and weren't crazy and weren't egomaniacs and were willing to acknowledge what they didn't know and listen to people that were experts on the areas they didn't know. I mean, to me, those are smart people and smart executives, is not believe you know everything, but kind of understanding what you don't know and being smart enough to defer to experts. That, to me, is smart management and good executive and good producing. And so when you're partnering with people like those, you tend to come out with a better product for the most part, and it's a smoother, happier existence, and you enjoy going to work. And so Dennis the Menace was one of those, and pretty much everything that we worked on with those guys in the future went well. I mean, not to say you didn't have disputes or conflicts, but the difference with people like that is when disputes or conflicts came up, they could be resolved in a reasonable, rational way. When you have these despotic rights holders and insecure right holders, if you had disputes or disagreements, they were not resolved in a reasonable way. They turned into huge blow-ups, and they became personal, and it was awful. So that's how it was. I mean, the worst one ever was a series called Beany and Cecil. Are you familiar with that one?
I've never seen it, but I suspect I know where you're going with this.
This is a beloved live-action show, I think, from the 50s, a puppet show.
Mm-hmm.
And the creator of it, who was dead by the time we got involved, was a guy named Bob Clampett, who was one of the original Warner Brothers animators of Bugs Bunny, who worked with Friz Freleng and Chuck Jones and these legends. And so this guy, Bob Clampett, was sort of a legend. And he created this puppet show called Beany and Cecil. And we got involved in doing the animated version of it, and with his widow, Sodie Clampett, and her son, who I want to say his name was, I believe, Jed Clampett, but maybe I'm thinking of the Beverly Hillbillies.
I can't remember his name.
Yeah, well, anyway, what was her son's name? I can't remember.
I'm going to find it for you. I'll let you go on, and I'll tell you.
All right. Anyway, Sodie and her son were the rights holders in that situation, and she had an agent that was actively involved in this whole thing, and ABC was the network, and all started fine. And I think ABC wanted us to hire at that time an interesting choice for story editor, which I'll tell you in a second. But I should preface it by saying that this happened during one of the Writers Guild strikes. And when the Writers Guild goes on strike, most animated series, certainly all of the Saturday morning animated series, were not covered under the Writers Guild contract. In other words, when you wrote on a Saturday morning series, it was not a Writers Guild situation. And Saturday morning writers didn't get residuals, and they didn't get the same benefits. It was really sort of an inferior setup for animation writers, and all animation writers resented this like crazy. We all wanted to be in the Writers Guild. The Writers Guild wanted to have us, were willing to take us on, but none of the studios wanted to let that happen because it would have made it more onerous on them, and it would have been more costly for them to have Writers Guild shows. So the way the industry was structured at that time, and is still largely structured, is all the Saturday morning and kids animated shows were not Writers Guild shows, whereas later shows like The Simpsons and such were Writers Guild shows. But anyway, back then when we did Beany and Cecil, the Writers Guild was on strike, and so a lot of live action writers that otherwise would not have been available to work in animation needed the work. And there was a writer by the name of, drumroll, Chuck Lorre, who, by the way, got his first writing gig at Deke before I worked there. At the dawn of Deke, Chuck Lorre's career actually started at Deke. And for anybody listening that doesn't know who Chuck Lorre is, and I can't imagine there is anybody, but he went on to do Big Bang Theory and
Two and a Half Men.
He did so many prime. Pardon me?
2.5 Men.
2.5 Men.
Roseanne at one point.
Mom, is that the one that's on now? I don't watch a lot of prime time, but he went on to be arguably the most successful primetime showrunner and producer in history. Worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars and playing golf with President Obama. I mean, and in the Television Hall of Fame. I mean, really truly one of the most successful creators in television history. Got his first job at Deke, and in this my story I'm telling became the story editor for Beany and Cecil while he was working on primetime. I think he was working on Roseanne. I think he was working on Roseanne. He worked on Roseanne. I think it might have been when he was working, or Dharma and Greg, or one of those. Anyway, ABC wanted him to be the story editor on Beany and Cecil, and Writers Guild strike, he was available, and he had a history of, certainly with Andy. I hadn't met him prior to that. And he said, okay. So we hired Chuck Lorre to be our story editor. Great. And then Sodie wanted a director by the name of John Kricfalusi.
Yay, this is where I thought you were going with this.
Yeah. And this guy was sort of a notorious bad boy in animation. Really talented, by the way. Super, super talented guy. Gifted. But just not somebody willing to sort of play by the rules and just had his own ideas and really didn't seem to care what anybody else thought. He went on to do Ren and Stimpy, which, as anybody who knows that show, really pushed the boundaries of things like taste and network censors and all that stuff. So, okay, so we've got Chuck Lorre, we got ABC, and we got John Kricfalusi, and we got Sodie Clampett, who is the widow of the beloved Bob Clampett.
By the way, Bob Clampett Jr. is the son.
Okay. I can't believe I said Jed Clampett. That is really stupid. I'm really starting to feel like an old man now. That is funny. I'm just laughing at myself. Jesus, that is bad.
She didn't call him Granny.
Anyway, so we're off to I'll say that again. So we're off to the races with Chuck Lorre, ABC, John Kricfalusi, Sodie Clampett, who is the widow of this beloved animation creator, and Andy Hayward and Robby London in the middle of all this. And, it all starts, all series start with the best of intentions. And I don't know how quickly, but this thing went so far south where every single person was fighting with every other person. I mean, it was just a nightmare. They all hated each other by the end of it. Although I think Chuck and ABC were sort of on the same side of things, but they were on the completely opposite side of the Clampetts, and I'm not sure where John Kricfalusi was in all of it, but he just basically did what he wanted and paid no attention to anybody. And he would put stuff in there that was so inappropriate. He'd sneak things in, and there was subliminal cuts of things that he was trying to put in, where he'd put in 2 frames that you wouldn't see unless you stopped the film. And I think almost everything he tried to put in, Kricfalusi, got caught. But the networks had a division called Standards and Practices, which was essentially the network censors, and their job was to make sure nothing inappropriate went on the air, and their job was also to decide what was appropriate and inappropriate, what was allowable and what was not allowable. And they reviewed scripts, by the way, too. And I should add, when I named all the people that weren't getting along, there was also the Network Standards and Practices Department that had to review and approve every script. And they were frequently at odds with their own creative executives. In other words, the creative executives sort of had the creative approvals, and the Standards and Practice executives had the we will allow this, we will not allow this kind of approvals. And they would frequently butt heads. So, I mean, I just can't tell you how much conflict there could be on certain series with all these parties all having rights. And Beany and Cecil was the apex or nadir, depending on how you want to look at it, of the most difficult situation I've ever been in my career in terms of conflicting approvals and conflicting personalities and headstrong personalities. And as such, it was the only series that I know of in history. Networks always order 13 half hours, and the way animation is produced, you have to finish all 13 scripts long before first episode goes on the air. So, you have to have a real lead time in animation. And so we wrote 13 scripts, I'm sure. But Beany and Cecil was the only, and we probably were in production, at some stage of production, on 13 episodes. Beany and Cecil is the only network series that I am aware of that was canceled before even 13 episodes aired. And it wasn't because of ratings. It was because of conflict. And it ended up in a tremendous lawsuit. And I'm going on a long time about this because it's just it's a funny story. But
well, people want to hear.
But ended up in a lawsuit. It's the only time I've ever been deposed in court. I wasn't in court, but I was in the deposition. It's the only time I remember being in a deposition. And there were issues like, apparently John Kricfalusi submitted a storyboard that put testicles on the sea serpent, which is so inappropriate and so beyond the pale of what Standards and Practices would ever allow. And I think he tried to sneak it in after Standards and Practices had given their approvals to the storyboard. I think Kricfalusi had somehow tried to sneak it into the animation without any of us knowing it. He did things that none of us knew about. He was fired eventually, of course. And I mean, I would get asked things like, this is under oath. I'm being testifying under oath. There's a court reporter, and Mr. London, can you tell us why you would put testicles on a sea serpent? And I would say things like, I suppose so it could reproduce. I mean, the whole thing was so nonsensical. I mean, even the court reporter would crack up. I mean, it was a riot. It was funny, but it was also a nightmare at the same time. And I think ultimately the the lawsuit settled, and we all moved on, and that was the end of that. But it was really the most. It had the most drama of anything I ever worked with Beany and Cecil. I don't know what got me into that. I think we were talking about difficult
people to work with.
Yeah, and the irony is the irony of that is I really none of those people were particularly difficult. They were just all headstrong, and they had different ideas. I mean, Sully Clampett was a lovely person, and I was very friendly with her agent, who was right in the middle of her agent was totally in the middle of all this stuff, and. I got along great with Chuck Lorre. He was fine. And I got along fine with ABC. This was a case where there wasn't really, somebody that I would blame. It was just a situation where you had parties that were granted rights and had completely different opinions and did not want to give up their rights. You
listed all of the parties involved except one for the "We're Nice People."
You mean on that show? You mean?
You said that. Yeah, you said Chuck was great. You said the Clampetts were great. You said ABC was great. There was one person you left out. John.
Oh, Kricfalusi?
Yeah.
Here's the truth. I didn't have that much dealings with Kricfalusi because once the scripts were done, to some degree the work went out of my purview. We always had people that were in charge of sort of the physical production of the animation. That wasn't really my expertise. And so I had some dealings with them, but it wasn't a lot. But listen, my dealings with Kricfalusi were, he was not an unpleasant person at all. He was personable. He was very personable. John Kricfalusi was not an unlikable person. He was just a rebel. He was the kind of person I was when I didn't have to be an executive. When it wasn't my problem, I would have done the same things, would have wanted to do the same. I mean, I personally like the kind of humor that John Kricfalusi does. And I like things that push the envelope, and I'm not easily offended. So I didn't have a creative problem with Kricfalusi did, but he just didn't accept the realities of what you could get away with and what you couldn't. I mean, he was not a realist, and I was. I think that would be the difference, I would say, between the John Kricfalusis of the world and me. It wasn't a difference in taste or sensibilities. It was a difference in accepting reality. Because ultimately all the things he did not get on the air. They were all for no purpose at all other than to entertain himself. They didn't make it through.
Did you guys ever slip the things in that they always talk about? They call it slipping things past the radar, try to sneak in subtle things past the censors on various shows?
Yes, sometimes you would. I would never allow for anything that I was the one amongst my many other duties at Deke. I was the one that was responsible for answering all complaints. Anytime there was a viewer complaint or a sponsor complaint or any kind of a complaint about our programming, I was the one that would have to deal with it. That's what I used for my standards. And my instinct was, if I felt I could, in good conscience, defend what we did from any complaint, I would allow it. To the degree I could control it, sometimes it wasn't up to me. On the network series, it was ultimately the network standards and practices division that were the final arbiter of those things, not me. I was not the final arbiter on those series. But on syndicated series, I was to some degree the final arbiter of taste and I was the ultimate censor on series because syndication didn't really have a mechanism for censorship. I was it. And that was the standard that I used was if I felt I could defend it in good conscience, I would let it go by. In terms of slipping things by, yeah, sometimes you would do it if you felt it really wasn't hurting anybody and it was just sort of a sly thing you could get away with that maybe people would notice, maybe people wouldn't, but it wasn't really going to do any damage. I was okay with it. I'd let it go. And some of the other strategies you would do, and you've heard this, I'm sure, is sometimes you would deliberately write things in and put things in that you knew were going to be censored. So it would sort of take the censor's attention away from the other things that you hoped they wouldn't bother. Like you hoped that on a given script they would only spend so much time and only haggle you over a certain number of things. Sometimes you'd put in things that you were willing to give over and you were willing to give up in hopes that they would overlook the things that you felt were important and you hoped they wouldn't give up. So that certainly was a strategy that was used, yes. It was a chess game. It was a battle of wits sometimes with the censors because I think all creators, myself included, would feel that the censors could really sometimes be overzealous and sometimes to a ridiculous degree. And as I mentioned, they were oftentimes fighting with their own Oftentimes we would be in cahoots with the network's programming department. Together we would go fight the censors. So it was oftentimes an internal fight at the network over, what would be allowed and what wouldn't be allowed.
You guys did the very first ever animated version of Barbie.
Yes, that's right. We did. That's right. That's an interesting one. I had a good experience with Mattel from He-Man, and so I think I had a little bit of credibility there, and I knew people there, and had a history there, which was good. Really helped. And the thing about Barbie is it was their highest grossing property. It was their special princess in terms of revenue. I'm not talking about in terms of her personality. I'm talking about in terms of revenue to the company and importance to the company. They were extremely protective of that property, and understandably so. And we would frequently find ourselves dealing with companies where we were dealing with their golden goose, and so you could understand why they would be extremely, I will not say overzealous in that case, just zealous in terms of protecting this huge revenue generator for the companies. So yeah, they were tough on Barbie, but I understood it. I mean, they were not. I do not remember them being unreasonable on Barbie, and they had this long history and track record of kind of what worked. They really knew their property and knew their character and knew their audience. So I don't remember having a lot of. I remember being very restricted. That we were, there were a lot of limits and a lot of things we couldn't do, but we knew them going in. I remember Mattel being sort of clear about them and reasonable about them, and they made sense. So I don't remember it being a terrible trauma, frankly, to work on it. I mean,
did you work on Hey Vern? It's Ernest.
Yes. Oh, I loved working on that. That was great. That was a live action series, and I'll be honest, I had very little to do with it. It was the guy that created that whole property was a director by the name of, funny name, Buster Cherry. That was his name. I think his real name might have been John Cherry, but everybody knew him as Buster, so his name was Buster Cherry. And he was based in Nashville. And I think he came out of the advertising world. Hey Vern started off as commercials. I think they were commercials for an auto dealership when they first started, if I'm not mistaken. And that's where that character came out of, Jim Varney. And I think I don't remember I think the movie, they had a movie first before our series, I believe. But it was pretty. And our series might have come in the middle of their movies. They had more than one movie, and I think maybe our series was in between movies or something like that. But it was pretty much Buster's baby. I mean, I think we got in touch with Buster and got the idea of pitching it to the network, which was a good idea. And the network liked it. They were doing Pee-wee's Playhouse at the time, and they thought this would be a great companion piece to Pee-wee's Playhouse, which was live action. And it was all filmed in Nashville. I got to go to Nashville. And, I mean, I looked over all the scripts, and I was more kind of like the network suit in a way in that, because the network they had approval rights, of course, but they didn't really get involved. So I was sort of the DEEC representative just to make sure things were on track, and if they had any questions about what was permissible in Saturday morning television, I was obviously knowledgeable in that. I was more of a consultant than a creative participant in that series. But I got to know, a lot of the actors, and was there for the shooting, and it was just a really fun experience for me, and I thought the show was great, and it did okay. It only lasted a season, so I guess it didn't do really well, or it would have lasted more than a season. But it was a good experience, and I think the show was a good legacy. But I'll tell you a funny story that came out of that one, and then remind me if there's another story, a funny story I'll tell you about ridiculous restrictions that rights holders could give. This was the most ridiculous I've ever experienced. But getting back to Hey Vern, it's Ernest. One of the characters in that, there's some outrageous ideas, really creative, super creative ideas that Buster and his team came up with. But one of them was a giant tongue, as in a mouth, and the tongue was like a character. And I think he had a voiceover or something. I don't remember. And I remember there was one scene where the mouth, was going to the dentist, and you see this giant hypodermic needle come in to shoot the tongue with Novocaine, and the tongue is trying to avoid getting the shot of Novocaine. And the dentist is basically portrayed as the enemy in this skit, because the mouth doesn't want anything to do with the dentist. It was really funny, it was innocuous, truly innocuous. And sure enough, after this comes on the air, I get a letter from the Organization of Pediatric Dentists or something like that, complaining that we have misrepresented dentistry, done a great disservice, the kids are already super afraid of Dennis as it is. And I think this letter ended with, oh, contrary to your portrayal, your damaging portrayal, or whatever they put, dentistry is painless and pleasant. Something like that. I mean, I found the whole letter to be just ridiculous. And so I always felt it was obliged to respond to these letters, and I always did, no matter what the letter was. I would try to make a courteous response. And I don't remember what I said, but I think they wrote me back again, and they just went on and on about how wonderful it was to go to the dentist and how, that made it so pleasant. And I don't remember exactly what I said. I don't have a good punchline for this story, but I have another story like this. It does have a good punchline. But anyway, I basically said, listen, sorry if you were offended by this. We felt it was all in good fun. And I said, in my opinion, it is certainly not painless to go to the dentist. I'm not suggesting in any sense that people should not go to the dentist, but to suggest that it's painless and pleasant is unrealistic, inaccurate, and I don't accept it or something like that. And that was the end of it. But I just thought it was a ridiculous complaint, honestly. I mean, if you were to see the skit that generated this complaint, it was emblematic of how challenging it could be to put children's television on the air, because it's going out to such a mass audience, and no matter what you did, you were bound to offend somebody.
Camp Candy.
Yes, that was a really great series to work on. My first encounter with John Candy, I forget exactly how the deal was. Oh, I know how it was. I'm sure this is how it happened. We were represented during this era by CAA, Creative Artists Agency, which during these years in Hollywood was the most powerful entity in Hollywood. And its founder and principal was a guy named Mike Ovitz. And anybody who knows the entertainment business in that era doesn't need me to say it, but for anybody who doesn't, Mike Ovitz was the single most powerful person in Hollywood, period. End of story. He controlled so many stars, dictated the studios. I mean, the amount of power and influence and clout that this one man had for a few years, and his agency, it was just beyond the pale. And we were fortunate enough to be represented by them, and they opened so many doors to us. And I'm sure that's how Andy must have gotten Ghostbusters. I'm sure. Anyway, I'm sure that's how we got put together with John Candy. I'm sure John Candy must have been a CAA agent, because this was the height of his career, his movie career. And our first meeting with John Candy, we flew to Chicago. He was filming Uncle Buck in Chicago. And we met him at his hotel, and we walked with him up Michigan Avenue to some restaurant to have dinner. And walking up Michigan Avenue with John Candy was just amazing. I mean, you can't miss him. Everybody knew him. I knew who he was, and gawked. And you're in Chicago. You're not in L.A. where people are used to seeing stars. I mean, it was really amazing. This stroll for 3 blocks up Michigan Avenue with John Candy, and he was extremely, extremely gracious and nice. Just a wonderful. Really was fond of John. And I mean, I didn't know him then, but I got to know him during the course of the production, and he was just super, and a real pleasure, real gentleman. And I remember at the restaurant, we went up to this restaurant, and we were having dinner. And I remember that during the dinner, some very drunk woman came over and interrupted us, quite obnoxiously, I have to say. She's drunk out of her mind. She goes, I know you're that guy Jim Dandy. Just can I take your picture? This was before cell phones, but she had a camera, And to his credit, I mean, this woman, he should have blown her off. And he was so gracious and let her take a picture, and, just couldn't have been nicer. So that was my first experience with John Candy. So I knew we were kind of off to a good start. And we put a story editor on there that we ended up working with a lot, named Judy Rothman, who was not only just a tremendous talent, but a really fun person to work with, and just a great personality and a pleasure. Always a pleasure to work with. I worked with Judy a lot over the years. And became friendly with her. Well, she actually too. She did. I should restate that she did the second season of Camp Candy. The first season we used a different writer named Jack Mendelson, who was a real pro and knew what he was doing. But anyway, and was easy to work with as well. So I had a good feeling about Camp Candy from the beginning. We did it in conjunction with Saban Productions. They were our co-producer on that, and they were involved as well. But we had, super good relations with them, too. They were our partners by choice. We didn't really fight, except there was one small fight about the credits on that series, which is also kind of funny. I should go on. That's another story. Anyway, Camp Candy was on NBC. It did well. It won a Humanitas Prize Award, which is a really wonderful, prestigious award to win, which is given based on doing something good, on having a positive message and a positive influence on kids. You know, sort of a do-gooder kind of award, which is really a proud award to get. And it's a writer's award, so the writer gets money, which is great. I love that the money would go to the writer of the episode that wins the award. So that was terrific. A funny story is when John first came to our office to meet on the series, we got all prepared and we're having this big star come to our office and all that. And sure enough, he pulls into the parking lot, and the first thing that happens is the guy that worked at the booth accidentally lowered his parking arm on John's car, on John's Mercedes or something. Terrible. Oh my God. But, John, thank God, was such a nice guy. And I got invited to, I think, a Christmas party at John's house, and I got invited to the premiere of Uncle Buck, which was really fun. And I was so, John smoked, and he was obviously overweight, and he was kind of a stressed out guy. I mean, it didn't reflect itself in any sort of anger, but he was kind of high strung, I think. And, it was a lethal combination, and I worried about it with the smoking, the weight, and, it's kind of nature. And I did worry about him, and sure enough, he died young, and not too many years after that, as I recall. And it really made me sad. Pardon me?
94.
Well, there you are. Yeah, not too long after that. And, really a loss. He was a wonderful talent and just a pleasure to be around and to work with. I really have nothing but good things to say about him. And his family's amazing.
Yeah, and his family worked on the program, right? To some extent?
I don't remember his family working on the program. No, did they?
Okay. His daughter voiced.
Oh, did she?
Yeah. Jennifer.
I didn't know that. You know more than me.
Yeah.
I wasn't involved a lot with the voices. We had a tremendous woman, just great woman named Marsha Goodman, who was our VP of talent and did the large bulk of our voice directing. And oh gosh, she was a winner. I mean, just one of the most fun people you would ever want to meet in your life. I'm still really good friends with her. And she just did a tremendous job with all the talent, whether they were unknown voice actors or huge celebrities. She was brilliant in dealing with them and making the recording sessions fun and giving them energy, and everybody loved Marsha. And so, I could have gone to the recording sessions if I wanted to. I had enough clout at Deke that I could pretty much do anything I wanted to. But there was no reason for me to go in most cases. There was a couple times I went, and one time I even directed. And mostly I didn't go to recording sessions and was not heavily involved in the voice casting, to be honest with you. That wasn't really my bailiwick. But the one recording session I remember going to, this is not to do with Camp Candy. We were recording Milton Berle, and it was for a special. I don't even remember what it was for. And I'm not sure why I was at the recording session, to be honest with you, but I do remember it. Because for one thing, Milton, bless his heart, was so old at this time, I couldn't even believe he was able to do this. He was caked with makeup, and I don't just mean regular makeup. I mean like practically cross-dresser style makeup. It was really bizarre and almost grotesque. And he did fine. He was professional and pleasant, but he was so frail that I was sitting in the control booth worried to death that Milton Berle was going to die at a Deke recording session. And that wasn't really a legacy I particularly wanted for myself or the company, not on our watch. So I remember below the glass of the recording of the control booth, so Milton couldn't see me, I literally got my wallet out of my pocket and pulled my CPR instruction card out of my wallet and was prepared to rush into the studio to perform CPR on Milton Berle if I had to. But somehow he recorded what we needed. I don't remember what show it was or what it was for, but we got through it. He was fine. He was pleasant. He did the job, and we didn't kill him.
Do you remember working on the 3 seasons you produced of the Chipmunks?
Yes, that was one where there was a super, super, super powerful and controlling rights holder. And I think he'd been doing the series long before I got involved with it. And his name was Ross Bagdasarian. He was the son of the original, I think he was Ross Bagdasarian Jr. And the original guy that did the Chipmunks was Ross Bagdasarian. And Ross Bagdasarian Jr. was extremely wealthy, extremely powerful, and had a reputation. I don't even know if I ever met him, to be honest with you. I had very little dealings with him, but he had this reputation for being extremely demanding and insistent. And he had these two story editor writers that had worked with him before, named Cliff and Alana. They were a married couple, and they were a delight. I did work with them. I did have a lot of contact with them, and they were super pleasure. They were really talented, really professional, and a pleasure to work with them. We used them on other things later because we liked them so much. And my dealings with Chipmunks were only with them, and they were very, very minimal. I mean, the Chipmunks, they knew what they were doing. They had their gig. They had the show down. It was a huge hit. It was generating money for everybody. Everybody was kind of happy with it the way it was. So Deke basically just sort of produced the scripts we were given, and there were no problems that I recall. That's my recollection of Chipmunks. So I can't tell you too much about it, other than it was huge success. It all was wonderful property.
I'm going to put all of these next few shows in the same category, even though they're separate shows, but they all have one common theme. So you guys did Super Mario Brothers Super Show, Legend of Zelda, Captain N, Adventures of Super Mario Brothers 3, and Super Mario World. So 5 Nintendo cartoons.
Yeah, it's good to categorize those all together because that's exactly how I think of them. It's just kind of like they're all Nintendo shows. I don't remember a whole lot. I remember a few things. The first thing I remember is I live in Seattle now. I've lived in Seattle for 20 years, and Seattle area, and I love it so much. And I was first introduced to Seattle by going to a meeting with Nintendo. They're based up here. And I remember their meeting was on a Friday, I remember, and we were going to just fly up for the day, have our meeting, and fly back to LA, which was very, very doable. And that's what I think Andy came to the meeting too, and that's what he did. But I decided at the last minute, it was a Friday, I decided I'd just spend the weekend in Seattle because I hadn't been here. And I literally fell in love with Seattle over the weekend and decided that weekend that this is where I wanted to live. Because I knew I didn't want to stay in LA. I despised LA, even though I'd grown up there. I really, really despised it. Anyway, so the main thing I remember about Nintendo was introducing me to Seattle, and I will be eternally grateful. I remember we pitched them on doing it. They bought the pitch. Yes, I remember all the different incarnations of Mario, and I remember there was some live action involved, which was fun. It was kind of wild. I remember one thing we had the actor that played. This is in the in the live action segments. I guess this is what I'm thinking of. This was not one of the network shows. We did a local show based on the Mario Brothers that was called something like King Koopa's Comedy Hour or something like that. Do you know anything about this?
Vaguely. It was. I didn't know that you guys were the producers of it, but I know what you're talking. I know what you're talking about, though.
Yeah, we were. It had a funny name with King Koopa's Control. It had all these K's in it or something like. I don't remember the name of it, but it was like one of these. It was one of these throwbacks to one of these old kids shows that was on the air when I was growing up in the 50s that were produced locally, just at a local television channel, and you'd have a kids studio audience, and they didn't make shows like that anymore. It was a real throwback, and we hired a guy that produced it, who I know quite well, great guy named Chris Bruff, and I'm still friends with him. And he was a character in and of himself, a total character, but he had live action experience, so we just turned this whole thing over to him. And it was sort of successful, except for the guy that we hired to play Koopa. Koopa was in a costume character, and he was in a costume, and he was the kind of the MC of the series. And it turned out this is like the classic cliche. I mean, I think there have been movies based on this premise. It's such a classic cliche, but he turned out to be kind of this ornery character, like a W.C. Fields type that hated kids, essentially. And so I don't remember any of the specific incidents, but I remember that Chris had his hands full because he had the studio audience full of kids and this character that was constantly on the verge of behaving inappropriately. By the way, and I want to be very, very, very clear, I'm not talking about sexually or molesting. I'm not talking about anything like that. I'm talking about just, swearing or being nasty or being grumpy or what.
Ornery. Yeah,
ornery, exactly. Chris used to tell funny stories about it, though. I mean, Chris would always come and tell us, he'd roll his eyes and have us in hysterics with the what he had to deal with in that series. But that wasn't any of the series you mentioned, which were the series you mentioned were all the national cartoons. The only thing I really remember about that is when we did Legend of Zelda, I think it was my idea. I'm pretty sure it was my idea. There was a primetime series on the air in that era called Moonlighting with Sybil Shepherd and Bruce Willis. That was the first introduction of Bruce Willis to the world. It was a great series and extremely popular. And the whole premise of the series were these two characters were stuck in a detective agency together, and they were constantly bickering. And one was kind of a wise guy, and they never quite got together romantically. It always seemed like they were going to do it, and they never quite did it. And I think I sort of borrowed, to be kind to myself, borrowed that idea and suggested that we do something like that with Legend of Zelda, where the kid, I've forgotten the kid's name. Link, exactly. And he had a crush on the princess, and he was trying to get it, and he never, they sort of bickered, and they bickered, but they had chemistry. That was really the formula for Moonlighting, and that was the formula we tried to embrace in Legend of Zelda, was they bickered, but they had chemistry. And I think, my recollection was that premise kind of worked pretty well as sort of a underlying character shtick for the stories. I mean, the stories weren't about that. The stories were adventures, but because they have to be in kids programs and that kind of program. But that was sort of the subtext and all of the sort of B plot going on. And my recollection is it worked pretty well. I remember more about that than I do about the Mario Brothers, to be honest with you.
I was going to ask a quick question. I don't know if you would even know the answer to this because we had an argument about this. Or not an argument, but sort of a discussion. Was Captain Lou Albano, because he was in the live action segment, was he also doing the voices? Do you know?
I believe he was.
Okay.
I believe that we used the same actors doing the animated voices as we did live. I'm pretty sure. I'm about 80% sure.
Okay. Which, by the way, why would a show like that was made in America, why would you guys use Canadian actors primarily?
Purely, I wouldn't say purely. I will say largely for business reasons. Because they're covered by a different union, the Canadian Actors Guild, whatever that's called, as opposed to SAG, which was the American union. And the union had different rules. And the main rule that applied to us, that made the difference for us, was that, and for all animation producers, you'll find that it wasn't just us wasn't just Deke doing this, but it was many animation producers who do this. The main difference was you could do buyouts of residuals. You could pay them one price and then never have to pay them residuals. And that was a big deal for us because having to pay residuals was A, expensive, B, made it harder to resell the shows over time because whoever bought them would be responsible for the residuals, and C, it was an administrative problem because you had to keep track of all the voices and make sure everybody got paid. And it was so much easier just to pay extra at the beginning and never have to deal with it again. And that was the reason. Having said that, a lot of the Canadian voice actors were terrific, so I don't want to in any way impugn them and say that the only reason they were used was because of financial reasons. There were some really good ones as well, but that was really the motivation. And in fact, Deke, I think very cleverly, we set up our own voice production company in Vancouver. And Marsha would fly to Vancouver all the time, frequently, to work there and direct sessions there. And sometimes I would go too, and our other producers, we would occasionally go to Vancouver for the voice recordings or to do with we had an actual office there that dealt with actors and booked studios and all that sort of thing. And we had a full-time employee there named Paul Quinn.
You guys found some big guys who went on to become big-name voice actors in the States, so.
Well, interestingly enough, I mean, in general, one of the things, this is sort of out of order of your questions, but when you ask me what I feel so proud of, what I feel proud about, legacies and things like that. One of the things I'm really proud of in Deke is we were incredible about giving people their starts and people that went on to really great things. And, the best example is Chuck Lorre, whom I mentioned earlier, who I believe, this was before my time at Deke. This was the very beginning of Deke before I joined. But I think the story is that he came to Deke as a salesman selling office supplies or something, literally a door-to-door salesman, and he found out what Deke did, and somehow he was Chuck is a very forceful, aggressive personality, and a great salesman, and somehow he wormed his way in and said, I can write or something, and got his first job as a writer at Deke. He obviously went on to an incredible career, but he wasn't the only one. We'd use other primetime writers from time to time, and one primetime writer that was referred to me was a man named Bruce Shelley, and we had a series called Cops at the time that we were producing, based on a Hasbro property. And we were having a terrible problem with the scripts. We were in big trouble, and the scripts were a mess. And for a story not worth going into, we were stuck with a story editor that was not the right story editor for that. And somebody referred to me, a man named Bruce Shelley, who at the time was an older man, meaning about my age now. And he had all these prime time credits. I think, I want to say Family Map. No, it was 8 is Enough. 8 is Enough was his big credit. And I was really impressed with Bruce. He'd never written animation before, and rarely would I assign somebody who hadn't written animation to a story-edited animation series. But I had a hunch, and I took a flyer. And he turned out to be absolutely fantastic. His only kind of precondition was he wanted to involve his son, Reed Shelley, who he wanted to basically teach the business, and Reed wanted to become a writer. So if we were willing to sort of take Reed along with the package, Bruce was in. And so we hired him, and he completely turned around Cops. He was just wonderful on the mess that he was handed. And so after that, we made a deal with him and Reed and put them on staff. We hired them as staff writers, and they were assigned to story edit several other Deke series while I was there. I think they were part of Mario Brothers, and I think they did The Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, one of our Sonic series, and I'm sure several other things whose credits elude me at the moment. But they were a terrific team. I became friends with Reed, who was, probably... He was younger than me, but maybe closer to my age. And Bruce was just a sort of a class act, classic television writer who was a pleasure to work with and a tremendous talent. We've had a lot of people that started at Deke and went on to have studios of their own. And we were known for really giving inexperienced people a lot of responsibility and just sort of throwing them out into the... basically Andy's philosophy, and this kind of applied to me when I first came to Deke. I really didn't have the experiences that I probably should have had to do the job I was being asked to do. But Andy's kind of philosophy seemed to be throw them in the deep end and see if they can swim. And some people sank, some people swam, but the people that swam would advance very, very quickly at Deke. And there was a joke about somebody being a receptionist 1 week, a runner the next week, and a producer the third week. And obviously that's an exaggeration, but it was an exaggeration based on how quickly you could rise and get promoted at Deke and how quickly you could learn. And it led to a lot of, had a lot of people who went on to primetime writing and having their own animation studios and being big, important people that got their start in very small jobs at Deke. So I'm not sure which voice actors you had in mind, because that wasn't my area quite as much, but wouldn't surprise me. Who
Tara Strong, who is now probably listed as the greatest female voice actor of all time. She's Batgirl. She's Lord knows how many.
What did she do at Deke? I don't remember.
She was Hello Kitty when she was 14 or 13.
Oh my goodness, I wouldn't have no way of remembering that. Wow, no, I had no idea. We used to use Tim Curry a lot.
Yep.
He went on to bigger things. And of course, in some series, we got incredible celebrities doing our shows. We've had a couple of series.
So I want to talk about the Television Act in 1990, the Children's Television Act.
Boy, that is a huge topic, and probably not that interesting one to anybody listening, but I was so heavily involved in that I could talk for a long time on it.
We'll try to condense it down to a little bit, but what is your memory of it coming from when it started?
Okay, well, first of all, children's television was always a lightning rod for politicians. It was a great, easy thing for politicians to attack and sort of make us look bad and make them look good with impunity. There was really no lobby that they were hurting in attacking children's television. So there was always a lot of, even back to my days in He-Man, when He-Man was announced as a series, and I wrote the very first episode of He-Man. I wrote the pilot script. There was no script for He-Man before I wrote it. And I can tell you, as a person that wrote that script, that before it was written, there was an article in Time magazine where some child development expert was complaining about how violent and inappropriate that the He-Man television series was. This is before the first script was written, mind you. And in fact, He-Man was neither violent nor inappropriate. It had incredible pro-social lessons. But never mind that, advocacy groups and politicians, everybody, they're so quick to try to criticize producers of children's programs. So this was an environment throughout the 80s where education educators, advocates, and politicians would complain about the content of children's programs. And I won't say that their complaints were always inappropriate or inaccurate, but I will say they were largely inappropriate and inaccurate. So come 1990, it was politically expedient. I don't know exactly I don't know much about the derivation of it, but a law was passed that was to require all stations, all local stations, to get their license, and this would be enforced through the FCC, which granted license for television stations, had to air, I think it was, I don't even remember the number anymore, but I think it was 3 hours, I believe. It's funny, I can't remember the number, but some number of hours of, quote, educational children's programs per week in order to get their license. And if they failed to do so, they were at the risk of losing their license. So this raised so many questions and issues. The biggest question and issue was, how do you define and evaluate what constitutes, quote, educational, unquote? And I will admit there were a lot of abuses where people would, the ones that got the most publicity was apparently some stations ran the Flintstones and claimed that this was educational about prehistoric times, which I grant is ludicrous, and somebody else, I think, claimed that G.I. Joe was educational. Although, ironically, we went on to produce later seasons of G.I. Joe, and I will claim, in good conscience and very arguably, that we made a point to actually make some of our G.I. Joe episodes where they genuinely were educational. And the problem is you just assume because of the name of G.I. Joe, it's the same problem that He-Man had. You assume because of the name and the concept that you couldn't possibly put educational content in them. And I can tell you that we worked with experts, and I mean, we did one G.I. Joe episode, for example, that was about literacy and about how important it was to learn how to read and at what a disadvantage you were if you couldn't read. And that was what our story was about. And that was very much an educational, pro-social, helpful to kids episode. We did another one that was a really powerful anti-drug statement. So when people would make these assumptions that because this show had a certain title or a certain nature to it, that it could not have educational content. And that became a huge controversy in terms of enforcing the act. So in later, I think it was in 96, they came out with the rules and regulations that further expounded on the act and tried to curb what were perceived as some of the abuses. Anyway, when this act was first came, most of the local stations got their children's programs from the networks. That was the bulk of their children's programming outlets. So the networks were essentially forced by their clients, which were the local broadcasters, their affiliates, to supply them shows that would meet these new qualifications. So suddenly, this was a way to shows. Prior to 1990, prior to this act, there was a belief and sort of a track record that you could not have commercial success with educational shows for children unless, and here is the big exception, unless they were shows targeted to very, very young children like Sesame Street. Everybody would always point to Sesame Street and say, of course you can have successful shows that children watch and are huge successes and generate merchandise revenue. Look at Sesame Street. Everybody would always say that we're not in our business. And the response to that was, yes, if you want to target 6 years and under, they will watch shows that are educational, and it's not as much of a challenge. The challenge becomes with kids that are 7 to 11, which was the more desirable demographic for network broadcasts who had to sell advertising. PBS did not have to sell advertising. They could program whatever they thought was right and good. But in terms of getting money, you get much more money when you broadcast and program and draw viewers that are 7 to 11 than viewers that are 2 to 6. That's who advertisers want to target. And those kids, for the most part, would not watch when you try to put educational shows on that were overtly educational or trying to teach anything, kids could sniff it. And they were already going to school 5 days a week, and they were watching television for the same reason that adults were watching television, and for the same reasons that the adults mostly didn't watch PBS, is they want to be entertained. They want to escape. They want to come home from their jobs or their school and have some fun and watch and laugh and be thrilled and be frightened and have Jeopardy. And these are not educational components. It's not what they want. So it was extremely, extremely difficult to get a network to program to buy an educational show. We would have been happy to produce them, but the networks didn't want them because they wouldn't get ratings. And this is all before 1990. So the Children's Television Act in 1990 really, really made a sharp turn in this appetite. Suddenly there was now an appetite for shows that could be deemed educational, although the real challenge to these shows was to make them, a new word, a new buzzword came into play in our industry, which was edutainment. The goal of these shows was how could you make a show that was entertaining enough to get the eyeballs, get the viewers, but had enough educational content to meet the FCC qualification. And that became the huge challenge. And if you could meet that challenge, you could sell shows. And I give Andy a lot of credit because he saw this immediately. Andy Hayward, who was the president owner of it, he immediately saw this and basically directed me to start coming up with ways that Deke could take the forefront in this area. And I think we kind of did. We became sort of, from 1990 on, we became sort of, I would say arguably, I would say we were the most successful at certainly developing these kinds of properties and getting them on the air. And we had a lot of success with those properties, both commercial success and sort of critical and awards, and we felt good about them, and I felt good about them. And I think I was particularly well suited to do this because, I had a background in working with educational consultants back at Filmation as early as Fat Albert. We worked on every series with Gordon Berry at UCLA, and I had stayed in good touch with him, and I had a good relationship with him. And Don Roberts had worked on He-Man, and I had also stayed in good touch with Don and had a great relationship with him. I had a few friends in my personal life. One was a principal at a local elementary school. I had friends that were psychology professors. And I had been a psychology major in college and almost gone to grad school. And had gotten heavily involved in my psychology department when I was in college. And it was one of the best psychology departments in the country at University of Michigan. So this was really kind of my background. And it was of interest to me, and I really understood and could really communicate well with these people, and was a great I was really a good interface between the sort of academic community and the entertainment community and the writing community, which I had also come out of. And as part of that interface, I was recruited to be in an organization called Mediascope, which was a nonprofit whose mission was to bring together educators, advocates, and producers of children's television. I say television in general, not just children's television, but I'd say a special focus on children's television. And the whole idea of Mediascope was to try to promote programming that would help the world by bringing together these three groups: the people that made the shows, the educators that studied them, and the advocates that, pushed for policy, shall we say. And so Mediascope was an organization that brought these three communities together. And I was recruited to join Mediascope, and I ultimately became, first I became the chairperson of their board of advisors, and then I was asked to be the chairperson of the entire organization. So I became quite heavily involved with Mediascope, which was not a paying job. It was just, kind of moonlighting on top of my real job. So between all of that, between Mediascope, my dealings at Mediascope, and all the shows Deke was doing, and I think somewhere around that time, I think we put Don Roberts sort of on a retainer and paid him a salary just to be our general consultant. Between all these things, I became very, very heavily involved in these kinds of shows, and I became, I feel, somewhat of an expert on the whole topic of the Children's Television Act, how to meet the standards, what were the standards, where the line was, that you couldn't pass, what constituted educational, what you couldn't do, and especially how to develop these shows that were legitimately edutainment shows, namely shows that both entertained and could get ratings while at the same time met educational standards. And that became a really big part of my job, from 1990 on, and especially from 1996 on, when they tightened up these regulations and made them even more enforceable.
What are some of the ways you go about meeting educational content requirements on a show?
Well, for one thing, you have to define what your curriculum is. And the key is the curriculum does not necessarily have to be a hard subject like reading, writing, or geography, although that certainly can be a curriculum. But those kind of curricula are much, much, much more challenging to make entertainment. So what you learn is that the kinds of curricula that lend themselves much more to entertaining stories are the sort of moral and social development curricula. How to get along in the world, how to deal with adversity, how to deal with being different, maturing, how to face challenges, how to deal with difficult people. I mean, all the sort of social learning that that kids undergo as they transition from being infants to adults, the socialization areas, those are the things that lend themselves far better, are a more organic and natural fit with the kinds of storytelling that children enjoy. If you can weave those kinds of themes into sort of action adventure or broad comedy storylines, that's the secret. That's the ticket. That's the ticket. Now, Captain Planet is an exception in the sense that curriculum was obviously very much a curriculum of ecology and the science of ecology and consciousness of ecology. So that had a very sort of what I would call a hard curriculum. And at one point we tried to develop an animated series with Bill Nye, which I was really disappointed was not able to go forward. But that would have had a hard curriculum. And Carmen Sandiego had kind of a hard curriculum of geography. So you could go both ways. But the ones that tended to work the best, we did a thing called Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd Century, which was a show that didn't get a lot of attention, but that I'm really proud of. And that curriculum was logical reasoning. Eyes and brains. That was the buzz phrase, eyes and brains, Holmes. And the curriculum of that was deductive reasoning and logical reasoning. So you have to kind of pick a subject that is a legitimate thing that you're teaching to kids that will sort of pass the smell test of, is this really something that is valuable for kids to learn? And if you kind of pick the right curriculum and match the right curriculum with the right property, it can work. And I think we had several of those.
Yeah, you brought up Captain Planet, and that's a show that I will be honest, I honestly forget was a Deke show. For some reason, I always associate it with Ted Turner, and I know Ted Turner worked on it, but I forget Deke had any involvement in it. What's the story behind Captain Planet?
Here's the story. Ted Turner had an idea, kind of a one-sentence idea, brilliant idea, I might add, of he wanted to have a series with an environmental superhero. And this was way, way, way ahead of its time. I mean, this was long before. Now it's hard for anybody living now to imagine when environmentalism wasn't in the forefront of most people's mind. Whether you want to deny it or not, at least it's in the ether. People talk about it. Everybody's aware of it as a subject, and that was not the case so much in 1990. I mean, I'm not saying nobody was aware of it, but it wasn't. It had not become a big deal as it later became. And I think Ted was truly, in so many ways, I feel Ted Turner was a true visionary, and I think this was just one example. He had this idea of he wanted to do an environmental superhero for a television series for kids. And, he had a lot of money, and he had a network, so if he had an idea, he could make it happen. And so what he did is he dispatched his team to Hollywood and sort of put out practically a request. What is it? What do they call it?
Casting call? Cattle
or something like RFP? No. This is a social science term. I think it's called RFP, request for proposal, or something like that. I mean, it's not a showbiz term, but it was he put out the word essentially to the animation studios in LA that he was interested in doing this, and would be open to pitches from all the studios to pitch him on how we go about doing this, both creatively and from a business point of view. And so all the studios did pitch him in LA. They came to LA and they took pitches from, as far as I know, pretty much all the animation studios. And we developed the pitch, and we pitched him. And I'll give Andy a lot of credit. Andy is as good a pitcher as there is. And I'll give myself far less credit, but I was okay as well. But when Andy and I would work together pitching, I mean, I think together, and I give him a lot more credit than me. I really do. I'm not just being honest. But I think together, he and I made a really, really great pitch team. We were very different people and had different strengths, and I think when you put us together, we were really strong. And, we had great people working for us and great creative people, and we were the spokespeople, essentially, but we had this wonderful team that was producing the content that we pitched. So we pitched them. We did our pitch, and we basically won the competition. Of all the studios that pitched them, they liked our creative pitch and our whole vibe and everything that we were able to explain about how we did things and why we did them and our track record. And they went with us. For whatever reason, they went with us. We made a deal, and we were off and running. And it was a very, very interesting series to produce. Turner put his people on our series. He moved them out here from Atlanta. One guy in particular was moved out from Atlanta and was given an office at Deke, which is not typical for a normal rights holder. But to be fair, they were not just a rights holder; they were our partner, and so fair enough. But they had the people that they put in charge of us were smart people, very smart, and they were experts in ecology. I mean, that was kind of the way we sort of felt it should work. Is they were the experts in ecology, we were the experts in animation production, and I kind of felt like if we had each stayed to our strengths, it would have worked out pretty well. I think as it happened, I think the Turner people were very, very, very hands-on people who had strong ideas about everything and about how everything should be done. And it was not a great working relationship. I want to be very clear. I didn't have a personal problem with these people. They were fine people. It wasn't like I trashed somebody from Sega earlier. I didn't mention the name. I just mentioned there was, and she was not a good person. And I mean, she was not a well-adjusted person, and she was a troublemaker and not easy to get along with. The Turner people were pleasant people. It was always cordial, but they insisted on being involved in everything and pushed for things that we felt were not in the best interest of the ultimate production. And so we had a lot of conflict on that series. But we got through it. I mean, I'll never forget one of the memorable days of my career was we were really, really having a lot of problems towards the end of production, or maybe middle end of the production, and it had gotten almost untenable. And so we were basically summoned back to Atlanta, where their corporate headquarters were, to meet with the president of Turner at the time. And I remember Andy and I and our agent at the time, a man named Steve Waterman, a wonderful guy. We decided we had to go to Atlanta. We were summoned. I don't know why we did this. I thought this was insanity. This was probably Andy's doing. He's kind of a workaholic. But we got on a plane, I think, at 5 in the morning or 6 in the morning in L.A., flew to Atlanta, went to a meeting, got yelled at for an hour, and flew back to L.A. on the same day. That's one of the longest days of my entire life. But after that meeting, what Turner did is, I don't mean Ted, I mean the company, the president. I forgot the name of the guy we dealt with. There was another guy they had in L.A. that was working at MGM. I think they owned MGM at the time, I think. And they had an executive working at MGM, an older man by the name of Roger Mayer. No relation, but the same as Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, same name, but I don't think he was related. And his main mission there in L.A. was actually film preservation and restoration. He was kind of a well-known, very respected guy whose mission in life was to restore and save classic films, which is a wonderful mission. And this guy was sort of beloved and well-respected. And so to try to resolve the difficulties we're having, what Turner and Atlanta did is they said, we're going to have this guy, Roger Mayer, be in charge of our people in L.A., and you're going to have to work with this guy, Roger Mayer. So I went to meet with Roger Mayer, not knowing what to expect or what to get, but knowing that Captain Planet had become, a real pain and had a lot of difficulties. I went to meet with Roger, and he turned out to be somebody that I liked and respected so much. He was just, and he was, he didn't always take our side, but he was reasonable, and he had an entertainment background, and he was willing to respect the areas in which we were expert, which I don't think the Turner people did, and he kind of made this pulled it all back together and made it work. He reminded me really a lot of my first boss, Arthur Nadell. He reminded me a lot of Arthur. He had a lot of the same qualities. I think it has to do with age, I think when people are older, as I am now, I think, I just think they get seasoned, they get calmer, and they listen, and they try to absorb and not jump to conclusions and not be too reactive. And anyway, Roger Mayer was just what the doctor ordered for this problem. And I think, by the way, the Turner people would say the same thing. I mean, I think to Roger's great credit, he figured out a way to make everybody work together that we were all comfortable with, and we were able to continue the production. And I think it was a damn good series. It was nominated for an Emmy. I'm really proud of it to this day. People remember it. When I meet people today and I say I worked on it, that's always one of the ones that people perk up their ears. And it's something that I actually feel good about, even though there was a lot of challenges to working with it. And, I won't say I stayed friendly with the Turner people, but, I've had to have contact with them here and there for this and that, and it's very cordial. I don't have any ill will at all to any of them, and I hope they don't towards me. And, what else can I tell you about Captain Planet? There's a really funny letter story that I'll tell you, but I was trying to think of anything else to say about the production. Oh, well, what I was going to say then, what happened, the reason that you may not associate it with Deke, here's the reason, is we did a full season of Captain Planet. I believe it was 65 half hours that we did. We got the Emmy nomination. It was all well and good, and it was a success. And we were going to do another season. And in between the two seasons, Ted Turner decided to buy Hanna-Barbera. They bought the company of Hanna-Barbera. So now he owned his own animation company, and it only made sense for us to negotiate a deal with him where we sold him our interest in making future productions. And I think we sold our interest in the existing episodes too, if I'm not mistaken. I think we sold everything to him, but I know we sold off our rights to do the second season. So the second season of Captain Planet, we had nothing to do with. It was produced at Hanna-Barbera. So that may be why you don't associate it with Deke. So one season produced by Deke, co-production with Turner. Second season produced by Hanna-Barbera, owned by Turner.
What's the story about Tom Cruise?
Well, that's an interesting story. That's a very interesting story. I'm not at liberty to tell all of it, unfortunately. But what I can tell you is that we announced when we decided to go ahead with Captain Planet, we announced it in the trades. And our talent VP got a call one day, and the voice on the other end basically says, "Hi, this is Tom Cruise, and I wanted to talk to you about Captain Planet." And our recording, our VP says, "Yeah, well, I'm Ringo Starr. Nice to meet you." I mean, Tom Cruise calling Marsha Goodman, it was ludicrous. But it actually was Tom Cruise. He literally picked up the phone, apparently, and called Marsha, and environmentalism was a great cause of his. He was early on to that, and he said he wanted to play the voice of Captain Planet. And this was really when his career was just peaking. I think he had just done Born on the 4th of July, I believe, and had just been nominated for an Oscar, or that movie was anyway, if he wasn't. But he was red hot. Not that he hasn't stayed hot. It hasn't always been hot, but he was, I honestly think this was, might be arguably the peak of his career. And we were dumbfounded, flabbergasted, couldn't believe it, and ecstatic. This was incredible. And, it wasn't about the money. He wasn't going to demand an unreasonable amount of money. So Andy and I were invited to go over to, we met him in the office. There was an organization, a Hollywood organization called Eco something or other that was an advocacy organization that was trying to get big stars to promote environmentalism. And somehow they got involved in this, and we met at their office. We went down, Andy and I went down and had a long, long meeting with Tom Cruise. And I have to say, I'm not a Scientologist, but I have to say he was an absolute pleasure. He was gracious. He was modest. He was, kind. I mean, I was really, really bright, extremely bright, committed. I don't have a bad word to say about him. He couldn't have been more terrific. And it was a great meeting. I think he liked us. He liked what we had to say. He was really interested in doing it. And we offered to give him a tour of the studio the next day, which he accepted. So the next day, or maybe it wasn't the next day, but it was that week, Tom Cruise came out to Deke, and Andy and I walked him around. I mean, you can imagine that these artists and everybody and the secretary. I mean, we're walking around with Tom Cruise. It was really quite a memorable moment. And it was all great, and he signed on, and we were on business. And because we got Tom Cruise, and this is definitely the way Hollywood works. I mean, this is so true. This is always true. once we were able to announce that we had Tom Cruise, that was our meal ticket to get all of these other celebrities to do cameos. And we got so many big movie stars to do cameos. We got Jeff Goldblum and Meg Ryan and Ed Asner. I mean, he wasn't a big movie star, but he was a star. Who else? You'll know the names probably better than I. Yeah, I mean, we got many big stars, in my recollection, all to do cameo voices on Captain Planet, and then all Whoopi Goldberg. It was all because of Tom Cruise. That's why, and it was just wonderful publicity for us. And from my point of view, it was just a pleasure to deal with Tom. He was great, and talk about charisma, man. He really had it in spades. I mean, you really felt like you were with a star, but not in the sense of an entitled star. Just in the sense of somebody that had a special aura about him and was very, very gracious to everybody. Anyway, so at this point, I think his next film was going to be Days of Thunder, which was being filmed in, I think, Fort Lauderdale or Daytona Beach or something in Florida. And that was the film upon which he met Nicole Kidman, by the way. And he went off to do that, and our plan was to record him remotely. He couldn't be with the rest of the cast. We would just do the remote recordings, and ultimately he recorded a few, but ultimately he just felt that he'd gotten too wrapped up in Days of Thunder. Apparently it was a challenged production, and there was issues going on there, I think, and he ultimately had to drop out, and we did not use him, and he did not appear in the series. But to this day, I feel that we had a really good experience. I didn't fault him for dropping out. He did so graciously, and gave us notice and didn't screw us over, and we reaped so much benefit from having him involved, and it was just fun to meet him and actually spend some quality time with him. It was really great. So that's the Tom Cruise and Captain Planet story.
What's the letter story?
The letter story was, after the show had been on the air, I get a letter one day from it wasn't addressed to me, but it came to me, as person had to deal with this stuff. The letter was a complaint, and it was from some sewage workers union in Chicago or something like this. And their complaint was, we had one of our villains. We had eco-villains on that series, and the name of the villain was Sly Sludge. That was the name of the villain. And the complaint was that we were damaging the reputation of the word sludge. That sludge was not a bad thing. I still to this day don't quite understand the nature of this complaint. I truly don't. But somehow they were proponents of sludge, and the fact that we had named our character, an evil character, Sly Sludge, was offensive to them and detrimental to the planet and yada yada. I mean, I just thought this was one of the more ludicrous letters I'd ever received, and I've gotten some nutty ones. So, but I always try to respond politely, at least at first, to these letters, and try to give these people a benefit of the doubt. And what I responded was, I said, these episodes have all been produced, they've all been recorded, they're all in work. I mean, we cannot change what is already out there and on the air. It's not possible. I said, I will be happy, however, to relay your consideration to the rest of the producers, and it's something we'll look at for, if we do more. We'll look at, either change to a name or not using it, or trying to do something to mitigate and reflect favorably on sludge or whatever the hell it is you want. I didn't say whatever the hell, but the point is, I tried to be gracious. I said, there's really not anything we can do about it at this point. Thanks for making us aware of this. So the next thing I know, I start getting letters from all these different sewage unions all over the country. Clearly, what they had done is put something in their newsletter or their meeting or whatever, and basically sicked all their branches on me. Now they were all coming to me because I was the one that responded. And I'm now getting deluged with letters complaining that we had the audacity to name a character Sly Sludge. That was our great crime. And so I don't know if I wrote one more nice letter, and it didn't work, and I kept getting them. I think I don't know how many quite this sequence, but the ultimate way I ended this was I wrote a letter to the first people that wrote me, and I said, look, it's clear to me that you have put all your members, you've set all your members to write me, and, you think that quantity is going to make a difference, and I can assure you it makes no difference. I've given you the answer. The shows are produced. They're not going to change. We will consider what you said for the next series, and that's all that's going to happen, no matter how many letters I get, so you're wasting your time. And I said, furthermore, I said something like, if you would be willing to respect our expertise on children's programs and how television affects children, I would be more than happy to respect your expertise on processing sewage. And I never heard another word.
I feel like if that happened today with today's hyper-PC internet culture, you guys would have been in big trouble, especially with all this stuff.
Probably not. I think that one's too ridiculous. I think there probably are things that might have caused us more trouble today than because of that. But I think that would have been a laughing stock of everybody if they had tried to publicize it. I mean, can you imagine the late night shows having fun with that? I mean, and I just honestly, maybe there's people listening to this, although I don't think anybody will ever listen to it, but maybe there's somebody listening to this that agrees with them, but I think that one was pretty ridiculous, honestly. I mean, all we did was name a character Sludge. That was our great sin.
I've only been on this earth for 29 years. I have never heard the word sludge used in a positive context. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, come on. That was a silly one. The other silly one I once got was I got a letter from a witch on Ghostbusters complaining that we were doing witches because there was some episode where we had an evil witch, I suppose, on Ghostbusters. And this woman said we were basically giving witches a bad name. Anyway, the letters could be fun.
So you had a lot of big name talent. You had Tom Cruise, Meg Ryan, booked for Captain Planet. Obviously, you didn't use them. But then in 1991, Deke produced 3 celebrity-driven shows. You had Wish Kid with Macaulay Culkin. You had Hammerman with MC Hammer, and you had the New Kids on the Block.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, 3. I think I would have to say, in my opinion, 3 very forgettable shows, but especially in the case of New Kids on the Block, one of the most truly memorable experiences of my career. I mean, it was just amazing. I'll tell you why. But let's do the others first. Wish Kid, Macaulay Culkin. Well, this was after Home Alone. Macaulay Culkin was, one of the biggest stars on the planet, and as we always did, and we basically being Andy, this was kind of Andy's basic strategy during those years was find a hot property, get the rights, and use that, to sell. And that's what we did. We got the rights to Macaulay Culkin somehow. I'm sure it was through CAA, positive. And when I say positive, I don't actually remember it. I'm just inferring it would have to be that. I'm sure that's what it was. And we made a deal with Macaulay Culkin, with his parents, obviously. He was a kid. And we developed this concept of Wish Kid. We pitched it, and it was sold. And I don't think, frankly, it was a great series. Exact same deal with MC Hammer. Huge star. Made a deal. Pitched something to him. What we were really, really good at, I think. Really good at. And I say we. I really give Andy the credit, not me. Andy. That one of the things that Deke did a lot in that era, it was kind of our main formula, really. And it was something that I'm neither proud of nor did I like, but I want to explain why and how it came to be, is we became sort of known for acquiring these deals with these sort of flash-in-the-pan fad properties that were, in many cases, quick to come and quick to go, and just hot at the time. And quickly create these animated shows based on them. And, I think a lot of those series were not, as I said, really particularly memorable, But the reason for that was, this was, the cable networks had started to blossom during this era. And there was suddenly many, many more outlets for kids and more competition to the main Saturday morning network. Suddenly they used to be the only outlet for kids to be entertained. Now there were video games, there were cable channels, etc. And it was a much more fiercely competitive environment. And the networks felt that the way to get a leg up and the way to get tune-in, or sampling, as they would call it, would be if they could present a show with a famous pre-sold brand name, whether it be MC Hammer, whether it be Macaulay Culkin, whether it be New Kids on the Block, something that kids already knew, had already demonstrated a passion for. And the thinking was, if there could be a cartoon based on this property, kids would at least tune in and they would have a fighting chance. And so in many ways, Andy was just reacting to the marketplace. That was what the marketplace responded to. Those were the kinds of shows that we could sell. And there was just no appetite for original or more quirky or shows based on a property that was based on the quality and nature of the property itself rather than simply its fame and its visibility. So we did a lot of series based on properties solely on how popular those properties were. And these three, are a perfect example of sort of that type of show that we did. And most of them did not work too well and were not successful, and usually were gone in the season. And those three were all examples of such.
You said you had memories of working on New Kids?
Yes, New Kids on the Block was maybe my most amazing experience, although, gosh, I've had a lot. But this was incredible. When we made the deal, we met with their management, and they insisted, the management was great, but they insisted, they said, anybody that works on our show, they said, you can't understand the phenomenon of the New Kids on the Block if you don't come on tour with us. You've got to join us and come on our tour to really understand who these people are and what this phenomenon is about. And talk about an opportunity of a lifetime. So I and the two writers that we hired and the producer we flew to Chicago, and we joined a leg of the New Kids on the Block tour from Chicago to Nashville. Or no, to Birmingham, actually. We went through Nashville and to Birmingham by bus. And going to the shows, we had all-access passes, which meant we could literally go anywhere we wanted at any time. And the sort of greeting, I didn't really know that much about the New Kids on the Block. I obviously knew they were popular. It really was not my kind of music, so I didn't really know their music. I didn't know anything about the personalities or who they were. It was just a hot property. We had the rights to it. I think we got an on-air commitment pretty quickly, as I recall, because it was such a hot property. Usually you have to go through a long development, and it's a touch-and-go process, and you don't know till the very last minute if the network's going to pick you up. But I think on New Kids on the Block, the property was so hot that we got an instant pickup without even developing it, I believe. So a couple of the writers and a producer and I flew to Chicago. That was the first place we were going to meet up with their tour. They were performing in a venue outside of Chicago. And we were picked up at the airport by the limousines and rushed to the venue and given our all-access passes that we hung around our necks that, allowed us to go anywhere that we wanted to within the tour. And my first experience I remember is walking down this gauntlet of fans, of wild, crazy, young teenage fans on our way backstage. And the whole area was just lined and packed with fans that were roped off. And a 15-year-old girl, maybe 15, I don't know how old she was, probably 15, 14, who knows, beckoned me over and said to me, I will give you, I'm going to clean up the language for this, but this is not the word she used, but she said, I will give you oral sex if you can get me backstage to meet the New Kids on the Block. And I was shocked by this, and I don't shock easily. And needless to say, I declined. But that was sort of my welcome and initiation to the craziness and mania and just absurdity around the fandom for the New Kids on the Block. It was really wild. And it just kind of went on from there. We went to the show. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, it was just the intensity, the screaming, the wildness, the passion of these fans was unbelievable. And we went back to the hotel. The hotels, they first of all, they had all these decoy hotels and would tell people the wrong hotel so the fans couldn't find them. And, everybody was under pseudonyms. But nonetheless, no matter what they tried to do, the fans always found out, while we were on tour anyway, they always found out where they were staying. And these hotels were like armed camps. There were crowds all around them. They were in the lobby. It got to the place where the hotels had to institute these security things where you had to show a room key even to get in the lobby. And so what the kids would do in conspiring with their parents, with the participation of their parents, they would book rooms in the hotels just so they could get in and hang in the lobby and hope to catch a glance of the New Kids on the Block. I mean, it was just incredible. I've never seen anything like it. And the story that I've always related to people, which put in perspective for you, and you're going to find this hard to believe, but I give you my word, it is completely true. They were traveling with their dog. They had a dog at the time, and we actually put the dog in the series. And I got to know the bodyguards quite well, and at one point the bodyguards decided to take the dog for a walk down in the lobby of the hotel, and I went down with the bodyguards, one of the bodyguards and the dog. And people went nuts over the dog. I mean, and this was the lobby was just full with nothing but fans and their mothers. And everybody went nuts over the dog. And the dog took a dump in the lobby of the hotel. And two mothers actually fought. I mean, they didn't come to fisticuffs, but they argued and went who would be able to take the dog do as a souvenir. I witnessed this. This is the kind of craziness that this band engendered. And it was just fascinating. It was so much fun for me because I had always wanted to be a rock star. That was, I grew up my passion was the Beatles. And this was truly, while I wouldn't, not in a million years sort of compare the talent and the legacy, they're in different universes in terms of their music and their output and everything. But just in terms of the fan reaction, this really was like Beatlemania. I'm sure it was no different than Beatlemania. And we were in the eye of the hurricane. I mean, after one of the shows, this was really exciting. They would always race off the stage after their final encore. They had a shtick where the bodyguards would have to pretend to corral them on stage. They would try to elude the bodyguards so they could keep singing. That was the shtick, And the bodyguards would have to maneuver and literally carry them off, in protest when the show was over. That was part of the showmanship of it. And anyway, they would immediately, as soon as they got off stage, they would race into these limousines. They would jump into the limousines, and they would always have a police escort, to get out of the venue and get into the hotel. And a couple of the times we got to be in the limousines. I mean, they weren't all in the same limousine. There would be two new kids in one and two new kids in the other. And I would be in the limousine when they jumped in, and we would flee the venue. It was such a high level of excitement. And we got to know them and talk to them. And I mean, once you got into they would have a whole floor of the hotel, of course, for their inner circle and for their rooms. And when we were allowed up there with the all access passes, and we could hang with them in more quiet times and got to talk to them and try to get information that would help us with the show and all that, and got to know their whole entourage. I mean, we were temporarily part of the family for the 5 days we were on the road. And we were on the buses. They have tour buses that go from city to city. You sleep on the bus, and it was just an amazing, really, really fun experience, I have to say. Really fun. Really fun.
Who won the fight?
I mean, I don't remember. I mean, it was chaos. It was chaos. We just basically, our mission was to get the dog and get out of there and get back upstairs. That's all I remember. And in fact, I remember I had to kind of help the bodyguard keep people out of the elevator. The bodyguard was huge, and I'm small, so he did the bulk of it, but, it was madness. It was truly, you felt like you were witnessing madness.
Yeah. That's just incredible to hear, to be honest.
It was really something.
On a similar note, something I know you're a big fan of, that was somewhat of a disappointment. So you're credited with having created James Bond Jr., despite it not being a Deke show.
Oh, yeah.
What is the story behind that?
That's, for me, a great story. Another highlight. I'm sure I'm positive this was another CAA connection. I'm sure CAA must have put Andy together with the James Bond producers. And next thing I know, Andy is flying down to Mexico to go to the set of the James Bond movie that's being shot at that time. And I don't remember which one it was, but I think it was one of the Timothy Dalton ones, but I'm not sure. And I was really envious because I've always been a big, big James Bond fan, as so many people are. I'm not unique, obviously. But I really loved the property. And typically I would go with Andy when he would go on these first meetings with people. I was sort of part of he and I would go together to try and pitch these people and get to know them and sell the property. But in this case, he took his wife and I guess felt it wasn't appropriate to bring me in. And I mean, he was great about including me in almost everything. So I had no complaint then. I have no complaint now, but I nonetheless was quite envious that he got to go. And I was not invited. Anyway, he comes back and he says, we had a great meeting and we're going to do a James Bond Jr. series. And I say, this is fantastic. This is great. And he says, the main producer, he says, is a guy named Michael Wilson, who is married to Barbara Broccoli, who is the daughter of a guy named Cubby Broccoli, or his full name Albert Cubby Broccoli, who is really like sort of an old Hollywood legend. He was the guy that produced Dr. No, that really brought James Bond to the screen, that got the rights and was responsible for James Bond and the whole James Bond empire. His name was Cubby Broccoli, and he was a much older man at that point. And he'd sort of handed his empire over to his daughter and daughter's husband, Michael Wilson. And Michael had I think he had co-written some of the screenplays for James Bond, and he had produced them all along with his wife. And I mean, he was the James Bond guy at this point in time. And Andy said to me, we're going to do this, but Michael Wilson is insistent that they want to control everything, and they want to hire their own writer to develop it. They don't want to use our, typically when we would make a deal like this with somebody, it would be Deke's responsibility to get a writer and to develop the series in conjunction with the rights holder and with the rights holder's approval, but we would do the work, we would pick the personnel and all that. But in this case, Michael was insistent that they wanted to control everything, and they wanted to make sure there were no copyright questions and et cetera. They're very, obviously, extremely protective of their empire. So I said, fine, great. And then Andy says to me, I think there was some issue where Michael was having a hard time finding a writer, or he proposed a couple people that I don't quite remember the details, but at one point Andy says to me, he says, I had a great idea, Robby. He says, I told Michael he should hire you to be the writer. And I said, that's very flattering. I said, and apparently Michael was like that idea, even though I hadn't met him yet, but apparently Andy sold him on me, and based on, I guess, my background with He-Man and all sorts of things. When Andy wants to sell something, there's nobody better, and I'm sure he sold me quite well. So Michael agreed, and I said, Andy, there's no way I'd love to do it, but there's no way I can do this while I'm doing my job, because I'm trying to manage, 8 other series and 8 other rights holders and writers. And I had this immensely challenging, time-consuming, high-stress tightrope I was walking every day of my life. And it just, the prospect of trying to write during this just would not have been doable. So Andy said, I'll tell you what, he said, I'll give you a leave of absence. Don't even come into work. You don't have to, somehow we'll figure it out while you're doing this. He said, will that work for you? And I said, sure. I said, yes, that would work for me. Or I said, we can try it. And Andy said, I'll tell you what. He said, you can make your own deal with Michael. You can get paid, outside of your Deke salary. Make your deal, work for him. Genuinely, I said, great. That sounds wonderful. So I hired an attorney to make a deal with him. And I told the attorney what the parameters were. I knew totally what the parameters should be of such a deal because I was making those deals all the time myself. I knew the marketplace totally. And I asked for, a normal, reasonable number for this marketplace. And apparently Michael balked and thought it was too much. And it was it was an uncomfortable negotiation. I still hadn't even met him, but he said, there's no way I'm paying this. And, I said, well, that's the going rate. And, it was like that. It was a bad start. We got off to a very bad start. But finally they agreed to pay it. And so I go in for my first meeting with Michael, and I tell you, we just hit it off. He, again, kind of reminded me a little bit of my old boss, Arthur Nadell, my first boss, whom I so liked and so enjoyed working with. And Michael had very similar qualities. He was just a solid guy and very collaborative and pleasant and respectful and brilliant. And, he knew the property inside and out. And I'd done some research. I already knew everybody knows the property, but I'd done some research, and he turned me on to all sorts of things that I hadn't thought about, and, all the details and intricacies. I mean, he knew it inside and out. And so together we had a couple of meetings, and we talked about kind of a concept for what James Bond Jr. would be, how it would work. And I went off and I wrote a Bible for it. And, a Bible is a big document that basically describes and creates all the characters and the setup and the story franchise and tries to set a tone. It's basically an instruction manual for anybody writing a script for the series, is they would read a Bible and in theory be able to write a script, although they need to see a sample script as well, just to get the real tone. But you always start with a Bible in animation, which is not always true in live action, in fact, frequently not true. But so I wrote this Bible, and I have to say I felt really inspired. I felt I did a really good job with it. I turned it into Michael. He really likes it a lot. I mean, obviously I had a few notes to do that were reasonable and easily addressable. And then Andy gets it. Andy's the next person to get it. Andy loves it. Thinks it's the best Bible he told me it's the best Bible he's ever seen. I mean, Andy's prone to exaggeration, so I don't take that seriously, but nonetheless, it was good enough that he liked it. We had a distributor lined up named Claster Television, whom we had worked with before and had really, really good relationship with. Very, very close relations. I knew them well and would have meals with them and stuff, and we got along great. They love the Bible. So it's all looking gold. And I'm really, really excited about working on this and continuing to work with Michael. I know it's going to be a great relationship, and we're not going to have rights holder problems. And, it was all roses. And two anticlimaxes of the story. The first anticlimax is Michael was so happy with everything that he wanted to sort of take me out to a wrap lunch with Cubby. I was going to meet Cubby Broccoli, which is, kind of a big deal because Cubby didn't really get out that much anymore. He was sort of a lofty guy, in his tower. And Michael said, I want to introduce you to Cubby and we'll go have lunch. And I thought to myself, great, how nice. And this is, the James Bond. I'm going to go to a James Bond lunch. This is going to be, I'm sure one of the great eateries of Hollywood. It'll be a power lunch and all that. Well, it turned out to be at basically the equivalent of Denny's. My big power lunch was James Bond, which just cracked me up. I kind of like places like that, so I was perfectly happy. I don't really like the fancy places, so it was just as well for me. But it was just so funny that was my power lunch with Cubby Broccoli at essentially Denny's. And it was great to meet Cubby. The second anticlimax of the story is more tragic, which is, at this point, even though all this had happened, the business deal had not been consummated between the James Bond people, Deke, and Claster Television. There had to be a business deal that all parties would agree to. And sadly, a deal could not be reached that all parties would agree to. They could not find a meeting of the minds that everybody was happy with, and the deal fell apart. And so Michael he owned, as he had wanted all along, he completely owned all rights to what I had done, and took the Bible and went and made a deal with a much, much smaller, lesser-known studio called Murakami Wolf. They produced the series. They used 3 of the stories, I think, that I wrote for the Bible. I think became episodes I wrote very elaborate premises in the Bible for 3 stories, and I think they used them all in the series. And they were gracious enough to give me a developed by credit, although they did misspell my name.
How did they spell it?
They spelled Robbie.
Ah.
But, not the end of the world, and the intention was great, and I was appreciative to get the credit. And the epilogue to the story is, when I first took this gig, and Andy even said this, he said, who knows, Robby? He said, maybe you'll end up writing a James Bond movie. And that was kind of my fantasy all along, was maybe who knows, maybe I would end up getting to actually write a James Bond movie, which would have been really incredible. And I think I could have done it. I'm not confident I could have written a movie for anything, but I think James Bond is just something that I would have had a good feel for. I think I could have done it. Anyway, I get a call from Michael Wilson about 6 months later after this whole fiasco. He was kind enough to remember me. He called me up, and he wanted to hire me again to work not on a James Bond movie, but to work on. He had some other TV idea he wanted to work, and he wanted to do it with me, which was so flattering. I was so gratified to get the call, and it was great to hear from him. But I thought about it, and it was a little bit like, not quite to the degree, but it was to a much lesser degree like the choice point that I had earlier in my career when I was working at Filmation, and I got offered a job when I was first working at Filmation, and I got offered a job at Entertainment Tonight, and I had to decide, do I want to keep what I have or go try this new gig? And it was very much the same with Michael Wilson, although much more extreme, because I had this huge job at Deke. I was really being well compensated, and all Michael was offering me was just a little chance to work on another series with him. It would have been, I didn't even ask Andy if he would give me the blessing to take some time off to do it, because I didn't, in the first case, it was for a project that was supposed to be a Deke project, and it was in Andy's and Deke's interest for me to take the time off and try and make this happen with my writing. It was all for Deke in a way. But in this case, Deke would have had nothing to do with it. And so I never even told Andy about it or asked if I could do it. And I felt I had to decline it. And that's the last I ever heard from Michael. And I've always wondered if, maybe I could have gone on to write a James Bond movie. Probably not. I highly doubt it. But you never know how things happen in that business. And it would have been a wonderful opportunity, and I would have liked to have done it, but I couldn't do it. That's the James Bond story.
Would you say that was one of the biggest regrets or biggest disappointments career-wise?
Well, I think it certainly could have been the biggest lost opportunity. I don't know if it was a regret, because I think I made the right decision. Like, I don't look back and question the decision I made at all, to be honest. But I do think it could have been a life-changing opportunity. I mean, it would have been too big a gamble. The reward would have been the best thing that ever happened to me. But the gamble, the stakes that you had to bet to win it, be like, it was, think of it like buying a lotto ticket. It just wasn't worth. Well, that's a bad analogy, because there's no downside to buying a lotto ticket. But But I mean, the chances of it being great probably were like winning the lotto, and it would be like buying a lotto ticket for $10,000. You know, that would be a better analogy. So it wasn't really a hard decision, but it was a painful decision, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I can imagine. A bit of a tone change,
okay.
But it's one that I wanted to bring up just because it's the hot property. Where's Waldo?
Oh, God. That was a good one. God, you're reminding me of so much stuff I haven't thought about in so long. Well, another perfect example of acquiring a hot property. And, I mean, Andy was just so brilliant at that because he would acquire these things and the networks would buy them. And it was really, really, I can't tell you how difficult it was to get a show on the network in that area. It was just so challenging. And Andy, to his credit, kept finding these properties that were a way to do it. And these rights holders were always being approached by every studio in Hollywood. It wasn't just us going after these. That's why I didn't mention that earlier when I said Andy was good at it and that we were collectively good at it. But we were competing with literally every animation studio in Hollywood to get these. These were the hottest properties out there. Everybody knew that if you got the rights to do these properties, you had an on-air commitment. So you could almost certainly get on the air. Everybody knew it, and it meant so much money and so much success and so much access. So, and where's Waldo? Another great example. Andy got it. We made a deal. The author's name was Martin Hanford, I believe, and he sent a representative out to L.A. to work with us to be his rights enforcer. And he was fine. We didn't have any issues with his representative. But it was on CBS, and the CBS executive at the time, and was Judy Price. I'll just say she was an extremely, extremely challenging executive to work with. I would say of the three networks at the time, and they were all challenging, I would say Judy was the most challenging.
How so?
Well, I would say, and I'm sure she would disagree with this, but I would say she was, in my opinion, an extremely poor communicator of what she wanted. So it was extremely hard to kind of figure out what she wanted. And it felt like she changed her mind a lot. And it was extremely hard to get on her wavelength and please her. She was very hard to please. And she took a long time to try to explain things, and you couldn't really follow it. And she would call at odd hours. And she was well aware of her power, and that she held all the cards, and she was not in the slightest shy about executing her power, and I would say, I would use the word on many cases, indulging her power. I think that's a good way to describe it. And she was difficult. She was just a challenge. She was, and not just for me, I think for everybody that worked for her. And she would basically fall in love with certain creators and then turn on them. She was very fickle in her taste. She would be wildly enthusiastic about someone and then turn on them and say, they're no good. We had to fire a lot of people working on her shows because she changed her mind. Because they had, amongst other approvals, they had personnel approvals, the networks. So, that might have been one of our last CBS shows because there were a lot of problems on that show. And I don't even remember the specifics of it, but I remember we just couldn't seem to make Judy happy. And I think we went through a couple of writers and we had a producer, and there was one meeting where, and this, I want to be very clear on this, extremely clear. Judy Price did not threaten me with a baseball bat, but she had a baseball bat in her office. And one of the producers that was in this meeting would always tell the story that Judy Price threatened to hit me with a baseball bat because she did pick up the bat. I mean, she was not threatening me. I really want to be clear. She never threatened me with a baseball bat. But at one point, she was sort of holding her bat to make a point. And this story somehow morphed into Judy Price threatened Robby London with a baseball bat. Not true. But the seed was there. Some of the elements of that story were there. So that's kind of all I remember about Where Waldo. It should have been a great series, and I don't think it was, and I think it only lasted a season, and that's all I can tell you.
Okay. How about we talk about Cowboys of Moo Mesa?
Cowboys of Moo Mesa will be a very short answer because we had absolutely nothing to do with it except we distributed it later after it was produced. Our international. This was after we were purchased by ABC. I think we ended up ABC produced that series, not us. But when we were bought by ABC, we distributed it. That's it. Couldn't tell you anything more about it.
We'll talk about the purchase from ABC.
Okay. I didn't have a lot to do with that. My area, I really tried to limit my area to the creative area, and I had no aptitude for it, and I wasn't interested in the business and the high finance. It really turned me off, and I did my best to, frankly, stay away from it. So I don't have that much to tell you other than Andy would go to this. There's a big, huge TV market twice a year in Cannes called MIP TV in April and MIPCOM in October every year. And these are giant events. They're like the Cannes Film Festival. In fact, MIP is right before the Cannes Film Festival, and a lot of lay people get the two mixed up because they're both huge events with lots of celebrities, but one is focused on TV and the other is focused on theatrical films. And so Andy would go to this MIP and MIPCOM every year because we were distributing our series. And that's where you do a lot of the distribution work. You meet all the foreign broadcasters there. And I started going every year, too, eventually, which was one of the highlights of my job. I just loved going to this market. It was so incredible. Just amazing, amazing experiences every time. I mean, you worked like a dog and you partied like a wild person, and everybody was there, and it was just a powerful experience for me in every respect. And you were pitching all day long. I mean, the meetings didn't stop. It was just, and you were in Cannes. I mean, it was really hard to describe the immensity and power of those festivals and markets. They weren't festivals, they were markets for me. But anyway, Andy was going before I was, and I guess he got to know the ABC distribution arm. ABC had an arm that was distribution. They got to know Andy, and I imagine CAA was somehow involved, and they decided to acquire Deke. And, Deke had always had very challenged financials because we did not have any deep pockets at all, and animation production is expensive, and it's a very challenging business, and it's very hard to make money. And we had some very lean times at Deke, and we came close. I'm really proud to say we never ever once missed payroll, but there were some times when we came close, and there was one time when we had to lay off really a lot of people because our coffers were running low. So, the prospect of selling the company was an appealing one to Andy because that would sort of take away all this pressure, and plus it would mean a huge payday for him, which it did mean a big payday for him, very big. He really liked the people. He got along well with these people at ABC International. I think it was ABC International, I think it was called. It was that division of ABC. So they made a deal, and they became our masters and bosses, and fortunately, it was a very, very, very good relationship between mostly Andy. He was the guy that mostly dealt with them, although I got to know them as well, and I had some dealings with them, and they were great, and we had a great, really, really good relationship with them, and we would pool our resources when we would go to Cannes. We would use their stand instead of having our own stand. We would work out of their stand, and it was good. It was all really good, and that lasted for, I don't know, maybe a year and a half or something before Disney acquired ABC. So suddenly we had been swallowed by the whale, and then the whale swallowed a bigger whale. I was swallowed by a bigger whale, and that was a somewhat different situation. And I remember that you didn't ask about Disney, but I might as well mention it because it sort of fits. I remember the day that I was in my office and I heard on the radio or on the news, or somebody told me, I don't remember how it quite happened. I was in my office and I found out that Disney had acquired ABC, and my heart just fell to my stomach because Disney at that time had just a horrible reputation in terms of how it treated its employees. It had the nickname in those days. It had two nicknames. One was Mouse Switch, as in Auschwitz, and the other was Duck Ow, as in Tack-Ow. And a lot of people really didn't like working there, and that gave me a bad. Plus, who knows whether they would even keep Deke. They certainly had no need for Deke. I mean, we were a small animation studio that they were already doing just fine at producing animation for every outlet. Thank you very much. Who needs Deke? And furthermore, I mean, this is petty, but I just thought too, I had always heard that every Disney employee had to go to, quote, Disney University, unquote, and that one of the requirements, this is like a training, so you learn the Disney culture way, and that one of the requirements is you had to serve for a day as a costumed character at one of their parks. This was to, orient you to their culture. And I don't know, I mean, it was part team building. I don't know what the philosophy was, but I had always heard this, and I thought, the last thing I want to do on this planet is spend a day as a costume character at Disneyland. So, I mean, these are the thoughts that went through my head when I heard that we required it. I was sick. I really was worried and really upset. And it turned out, for me anyway, it turned out to actually be quite good in many, many ways. Mostly because we were so far off the Disney radar for the most part that they mostly left us alone, and we pretty much could continue on largely as we had been doing. And the only difference was we got incredible benefits. My title at that point in time at Deke was Executive VP, which at Deke it was no big deal having that title. It wasn't to me anything. Nobody nobody cared about titles anyway. But at Disney, which was this huge corporation, if you were to be an executive VP in the Disney Corporation was a huge deal, and you got amazing employee benefits because you were at that high a level. And I was able to keep my title, so suddenly, being an EVP of Puny Deke, I'm getting all the benefits of, Hollywood big shots that are, in the top echelon of Disney. So that was fantastic for me. I love that. And we pooled our international resources with Disney. So now at MIP and MIPCOM, we're now at the Disney stand, which was really, one of the biggest, best, most glamorous stands in Cannes in the Palais there at the marketplace. And I got to, travel. Their main offices at Disney International were in London, so I got to go to London really a lot, which I loved. And one of the really things I liked about it too was, I think I can say this without, I think I'm safe to say this. Andy, to his credit, I guess, Andy was an entrepreneur, and he was always pushing things and kind of wild, and sometimes doing things that we did not necessarily think were the best way to do things, and were pushing envelopes perhaps further than they should be pushed, in some of our opinion. But it was his company, he was the boss, and he could do it, and our job was to follow the marching orders, essentially. And one thing Disney did was it put a little bit of a lid on Andy in terms of kind of how he did things, and things weren't, it kind of reduced the chaos factor a little bit. I guess that's the best way to put it. Andy's management style could be quite chaotic. And I would say the fact that we were now Disney and had to abide by certain Disney strictures and guidelines and corporate rules, and we did technically have a corporate overseer from Disney, it kind of reduced the chaos a little bit. And it certainly eliminated our financial concerns. I mean, obviously now we didn't have to worry about making the payroll ever again. And it, for me, I actually ended up, and Eisner left during my tenure, and while we were there, and Iger took over. And I'm convinced, I've read a lot of books about Eisner, I'm convinced that the sort of unhappy culture, corporate culture at Disney, I feel a lot of it came from the top at Michael Eisner. I think he created a lot of the bad culture and the backstabbing culture there. And I think Bob Iger was much, much better. And I think the culture at Disney really improved when Iger took over. So, which was towards the end of our sojourn there. So that helped too. And so all in all, it's typical of things in life. Sometimes the things that you worry about most turn out to be not a big drama, and sometimes they're even good. And I think we had our issues too. It wasn't all roses. There were issues and challenges and limitations imposed upon us by Disney that I didn't like, much less Andy. But overall, being bought by ABC first and then by Disney, I think for me was a plus. 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 Was a plus.